The training hall beneath the old school building smelled of scorched stone and ozone. Rias Gremory stood at its center, her crimson hair catching the pale light from the crystal fixtures overhead, arms crossed as she watched her pawn stagger to his feet for the 11th time that afternoon. Issei Hyoudou wiped a trickle of blood from his lip and grinned anyway. That grin was the thing Rias found herself unable to look away from lately, the stubborn refusal to stay down that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with will. Again, he said, raising his left arm. The gauntlet formed around it in a burst of crimson light, red scales overlapping like armor plates, the emerald gem at its center flaring to life. Boosted gear, Drake's voice rumbled from the gem, low and amused in the way only a centuries-old dragon spirit could manage. You have broken 3 ribs and dislocated a shoulder in the last hour. Most hosts would be unconscious. Most hosts didn't have Bucho standing there watching, Issei muttered, low enough that only the dragon could hear it. Across the hall, Akeno Himejima pressed a hand to her mouth to hide a smile, though the mirth in her violet eyes gave her away completely. She stood beside Kiba near the equipment racks, both of them nursing the aftermath of their own sparring session, waiting for Rias to call an end to Issei's turn. You are allowed to rest, you know, Rias said, though there was no real command behind it. She had learned months ago that telling Issei Hyoudou to rest was like telling the tide not to come in. I know, he said. But we've got the raiding game against the Diodora group in 3 weeks, and I'm still the weak link. I felt it last time. Everyone else was carrying me. You defeated 2 of their pieces single-handedly, Kiba called over, arms folded. I would not call that the weak link. I got lucky. Koneko Toujou, curled on a bench in the corner with a bag of Pocky resting untouched beside her, spoke without looking up. You always say that. Every time you win, it's luck. Every time you lose, it's because you're weak. That's not how strength works. Issei blinked at her, caught off guard the way he always was when Koneko decided to say something longer than 3 words. She's right, Rias said gently. You've grown faster than any pawn I have ever trained. But growth like that comes with a cost, and I want you to be careful. Whatever is inside that gauntlet is not something to force. Drake, who rarely agreed with anyone about anything involving caution, was uncharacteristically silent. Issei noticed it. He always noticed the silences now, the small hesitations that had been creeping into the dragon's voice for the last several sparring sessions, ever since the fight against the fallen angel cadre 2 weeks prior where something strange had happened. A flicker, barely a second long, where the crimson of the boosted gear had bled into something darker, something the color of a bruise at midnight, and the scream that came out of Issei's own throat had not sounded like his voice at all. Nobody had mentioned it since. Rias had ordered the topic dropped, had told the peerage it was exhaustion, adrenaline, nothing more. But Issei had seen her face in the instant it happened, and it had not been the face of someone who believed her own explanation. One more round, Issei said, rolling his shoulder until it popped back into place with a wince. Then I'll actually rest, I promise. Rias studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded and raised a hand, calling a small orb of destruction magic into her palm, crimson and black, humming with barely restrained power. It was not a killing blow, not from her, not to him, but it would hurt, and both of them knew it. Come at me directly, she said. Don't dodge. I want to see how your boosts hold up under real pressure. Issei nodded, planted his feet, and activated the gauntlet's core function. Boost. The familiar surge of power rolled through him, doubling his strength in an instant, and he sprinted forward across the hall with a speed that would have been impossible for an ordinary human. Rias's orb came at him, and he twisted aside at the last moment, letting the strike clip his shoulder rather than his chest, and pain exploded down his arm. Boost! Doubled again. He closed the distance, fist cocked back, and Rias's eyes widened slightly as she realized he was faster than her last assessment had accounted for. She raised a barrier just in time, and his fist connected with a crack that echoed through the hall like a thunderclap. That was when it happened. The gem on the gauntlet flickered. Not the bright, steady emerald pulse that always accompanied a boost, but something else, a stutter, like a heartbeat skipping. For half a second the light around Issei's arm did not just fail to glow crimson, it inverted, becoming a deep, swallowing black edged in violet, and the temperature in the hall dropped so fast that frost crawled across the stone floor in a ring around his feet. Issei! Rias's shout cut through the sudden silence. He staggered back, clutching his forearm, and the pain was not the pain of a bruised knuckle or a strained muscle. It was deeper than that, a cold burning sensation that crawled up past his elbow toward his shoulder, and for a moment his vision doubled, and he saw, impossibly, superimposed over the training hall, a vast dark shape unfurling wings that blotted out a sky he had never seen before, a sky the color of an old wound. Boy! The voice was not Drake's. It was lower, ancient in a way that made Drake's centuries feel young by comparison, and it did not come from the gauntlet so much as it came from somewhere underneath his own thoughts, as though it had been waiting there, coiled and patient, for years. You have been asking to be strong enough. I have been listening. Issei. Akeno's voice this time, closer, and he felt hands on his shoulders, Kiba's grip steadying him as his knees buckled. Drake's voice returned, sharp and urgent in a way Issei had rarely heard from the dragon. Partner, listen to me. Do not answer it. Do not open that door. What door? Issei managed to say aloud, his voice raw. Drake, what is that? What's talking to me? The black light around the gauntlet pulsed once more, violently, and then receded, snapping back into the familiar crimson so fast it was as though it had never happened at all. Issei collapsed to one knee, gasping, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cold that had gripped the room seconds before. The frost on the floor was already melting. For a moment nobody spoke. Rias crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and knelt in front of him, her hands hovering just short of his face as though she were afraid to touch him and afraid not to. Issei. Look at me. Are you hurt? I'm fine, he said, which was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it was a lie, but nobody called him on it because his hands were shaking too badly to argue with. Akeno knelt beside Rias, her usual teasing warmth entirely gone, replaced with something focused and clinical that Issei rarely saw from her. She pressed 2 fingers to his wrist, checking his pulse, her brow furrowed in concentration. His heart rate is elevated but steady, she reported. No visible injury beyond what we'd expect from sparring. But Butcho, that light. That was not the boosted gear's usual aura. I know what I saw, Rias said quietly. Koneko had gone rigid on her bench, Pocky forgotten entirely, her cat-like ears twitching beneath her hair, a sign that only showed when she was genuinely unsettled. It smelled wrong, she said. Like something old. Like something that shouldn't be awake. Kiba said nothing, but his hand had drifted, almost unconsciously, to the hilt of the sword strapped at his side. Issei pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, trying to push away the lingering image of that vast dark shape and the wound-colored sky. Drake, he said quietly, so only the dragon could hear, though he suspected everyone in the room could guess the direction of the conversation from his expression alone. What was that? Tell me the truth. The dragon was quiet for a long moment, longer than Issei had ever known him to hesitate on anything. Partner, Drake finally said, his voice heavier than usual, carrying something that might have been the dragon equivalent of dread. There are things bound inside the boosted gear that even I do not fully understand. Ancient failsafes. Old locks placed there long before either of us existed, by hands wiser and more frightened than mine. What spoke to you just now was not meant to be heard. Not by you. Not by anyone. But it happened, Issei said. It's real. It is real, Drake agreed grimly. And it has been listening to every wish you have ever made to be stronger. The words settled over the training hall like a shroud. Rias rose slowly to her feet, her expression unreadable, though the tightness at the corners of her eyes told Issei everything he needed to know about how frightened she actually was, frightened in a way she would never openly admit in front of her peerage. We're done for today, she said, her voice carrying the weight of a command rather than a suggestion. Issei, you're coming with me to see Grafia. If there is something buried in that gauntlet that neither you nor Drake fully understand, I want people with more experience than either of us looking at it before it happens again. Butcho, I'm fine, really, it was just a weird moment, maybe I overexerted myself. Issei. Her voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough that he actually flinched. Then, more gently, she added, please. Let me take care of this. Let me take care of you. He looked up at her, at the genuine fear behind her composed exterior, and felt something in his chest twist with guilt for having frightened her at all. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, Bucho. Akeno helped him to his feet, her hand lingering on his arm a moment longer than strictly necessary, her thumb brushing lightly over his knuckles in a gesture that was equal parts comfort and quiet possessiveness. You scared me, she said softly, for his ears only. Don't do that again. I didn't exactly plan it, he said, managing a weak smile. I know. She didn't smile back, not yet, though he could see her fighting for it. That's what scares me more. Koneko approached last, standing on her toes to press the back of her hand briefly against his forehead, checking for fever with the same brusque efficiency she brought to everything. Not hot, she reported. But you smelled different. Like ash and something underneath it. It wasn't there before. Different bad, or different weird? Don't know yet, she said honestly, and that honesty was somehow more unsettling than reassurance would have been. Ask me again later. They left the training hall together, Rias leading the way with Issei at her side, the rest of the peerage falling in behind them in a loose formation that felt less like habit and more like an unspoken decision to keep him surrounded, protected, watched. Issei said nothing, letting the quiet stretch on as they climbed the stairs up out of the underground hall and into the old school building above, the autumn evening light slanting gold through the tall windows. He flexed his left hand as they walked, watching the familiar red light of the gauntlet fade entirely back to skin, and told himself the cold feeling lingering in his bones was only a memory now, nothing more. But somewhere beneath his own thoughts, in the space where a dragon's voice usually lived, he could still feel it. A presence. Patient. Waiting. Listening. The Occult Research Club room looked exactly as it always did that evening, warm lamplight pooling across the old furniture, the faint scent of Akeno's tea drifting from the small kitchen alcove, and yet Issei could not shake the sense that something fundamental had shifted the moment that black light bled through his gauntlet. Rias sat behind her desk, a summoning circle already forming on the floor before her, its crimson lines pulsing steadily as she prepared to contact her family's most trusted servant. Grafia will be able to tell us more, Rias said, not looking up from her work. She has centuries of experience with sacred gears and their anomalies. If anyone can identify what happened, it's her. And if she can't? Issei asked, settling onto the couch across from her desk, Akeno immediately taking the seat beside him with the teacup already pressed into his hands before he had even realized she'd moved. Then we go to my brother, Rias said simply, as though summoning a Satan for a consultation were the most ordinary thing in the world, which, Issei supposed, for her it probably was. The circle finished forming, its light intensifying briefly before resolving into the familiar silver-haired figure of Grafia Lucifuge, her expression as composed and unreadable as ever, though something in the set of her shoulders suggested she had come prepared for a serious conversation rather than a casual check-in. Rias-sama, she greeted, inclining her head. You said this was urgent. It is. Rias gestured toward Issei. Something happened during training today. His boosted gear displayed an aura we have never seen before, black and violet instead of crimson, and a presence spoke to him, something that was not Drake. Grafia's expression did not change, but Issei noticed the faint tightening around her eyes, the same tell Rias herself had shown in the training hall, and his stomach sank at the recognition. Describe the presence, Grafia said, her voice carefully neutral. It called me boy, Issei said. It said it had been listening to every wish I ever made to be stronger. It felt old. Older than anything I've ever sensed before, even older than Drake, I think, based on how Drake reacted. The Welsh dragon told you not to answer it, Grafia said. It was not a question. Yeah. He said there was a door I shouldn't open. Grafia was silent for a long moment, and in that silence Issei became acutely aware of how still the room had gone. How even Akeno beside him had set down her teacup without a sound, waiting. There is a legend, Grafia finally said, among the oldest devil families, one that predates even the Great War. It speaks of a third power sealed within certain sacred gears of significant lineage, a power older than the heavenly dragons themselves, bound there not to grant strength but to contain it. The legend calls it the ashworm, though its true name has been lost, or perhaps deliberately erased. Contain it from what? Rias asked, her voice tight. From the world, Grafia said simply. The legend claims the ashworm was once a dragon that walked the earth before the current age of gods and devils, a being whose very existence unraveled the natural order wherever it moved. It is said to have ended an entire age, not through conquest, but by consuming the boundaries between life and death themselves until nothing remained to distinguish them. The gods of that era, whichever gods those were, sealed it away in fragments, scattering pieces of its essence into artifacts across the world so that no single vessel could ever hold enough of it to wake fully. Issei felt the teacup in his hands grow suddenly very heavy. And you think a piece of that thing is inside my boosted gear? I think, Grafia said carefully, that it would explain what you experienced today far better than any conventional anomaly I am aware of. But I want to be clear that this is legend, Issei-sama, passed down in fragments and disputed even among scholars who study such things. It may be nothing more than superstition given form by your own exhaustion and the stress of recent battles. But you don't believe that, Akeno said quietly, watching Grafia's face with the same sharp attention she brought to reading opponents in a fight. Grafia inclined her head slightly, a small concession. No. I do not believe that. Not after what you have described. The room fell silent again. Issei stared down into his tea, watching the surface tremble slightly from the faint shaking of his own hands, and tried to process the idea that something ancient and world-ending might be curled up inside the same gauntlet that let him boost his strength during sparring matches, the same gauntlet Drake had lived in for centuries as a friend and a partner rather than a warden. What do I do? He asked finally, looking up at Grafia. If that thing wakes up for real? If it's not just a flicker next time? You do not let it wake, Grafia said, and for the first time her composed expression cracked just enough to let something like genuine concern show through. Issei-sama, I say this with the full weight of what I am telling you. If even a fraction of that legend is true, then the awakening of that power would not simply make you stronger. It could unmake everything and everyone around you, starting with the people you care about most. Issei's gaze flicked instinctively to Rias, to Akeno beside him, to the memory of Kaneko's worried face in the training hall, and something cold settled in his chest that had nothing to do with the strange frost that had crept across the floor that afternoon. Then I won't let it, he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a certainty that surprised even himself. Whatever that thing is, whatever it wants, I'm not going to be the reason anyone gets hurt. I'll find a way to control it, or seal it back down, or whatever it takes. Rias reached across the space between them and took his hand, her fingers cool against his, her grip firm. You won't be doing it alone, she said. Whatever this is, we face it together. All of us. Akeno's hand found his shoulder, steady and warm. Together, she echoed softly. Grafia watched the exchange with something that might have been the faintest trace of approval beneath her professional composure. I will consult the archives in the underworld and speak with Lord Surzex about what has been observed here today. In the meantime, Issei-sama, I would strongly advise against pushing your gear to its limits until we understand more. No further boosting past what is strictly necessary. No provocation of the presence you encountered. Easier said than done when I'm trying to get strong enough to survive a raiding game, Issei muttered. I understand the difficulty, Grafia said. But better a temporary limitation than the alternative. The circle began to dim, signaling the end of the connection, and Grafia inclined her head once more before her image faded entirely, leaving the room quieter than it had been in a long while. Issei set his teacup down on the low table, his hands finally steady, though his mind was anything but. Hey, Drake, he said quietly, once he was fairly certain the others weren't paying close attention. Is she right? Is that thing really what she thinks it is? The dragon was slow to answer, and when he did, his voice carried none of its usual boastful confidence. I do not know its true name, partner. I was not told, when I was placed within the gear, what else might share this vessel with me. But I have felt it stirring more than once over the years, deep beneath everything, like something asleep at the bottom of a very old lake. I had hoped it would remain asleep for the rest of our partnership. But it's waking up now. Because of me. Because you have grown stronger, faster, and more determined than any host I have known in centuries, Drake said. Power calls to power, partner. Whatever locks were placed to keep that thing contained were not built to withstand a will like yours straining against them for years on end. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because you deserve the truth, and because I intend to help you carry this weight for as long as I am able. Issei closed his eyes for a moment, letting the dragon's words settle over him alongside the memory of that vast dark shape unfurling wings against a wound-colored sky. Somewhere in the back of his mind, faint and patient, he could still feel that presence coiled and waiting, and he understood, with a certainty that felt older than the moment itself, that this was only the beginning of something far larger than a training session gone strange. Across the room, Rias watched him with a quiet intensity that he was too lost in thought to notice, her mind already turning over strategies, precautions, contingencies, the particular focus she brought to bear whenever something threatened one of her own. Akeno sat close enough that her shoulder brushed his, a silent reassurance offered without words, while Koneko had curled herself into the armchair nearest the door, watching him with unblinking golden eyes, alert in the specific way of someone standing guard over something precious. Outside, evening deepened into night over Ko Academy, and the wind picked up, rattling the old window panes with a sound that, for just a moment, seemed almost like the distant beat of enormous wings. Sleep did not come easily that night. Issei lay staring at the ceiling of his room long after the house had gone quiet, replaying the moment in the training hall over and over, the black light bleeding through crimson, the voice that was not Drake's, the terrible cold certainty that something ancient had noticed him and decided he was worth speaking to. He was still awake when he felt the familiar shift in the air that meant someone had entered his room through means other than the door. Akeno materialized near the window, moonlight silvering her dark hair, dressed in a simple yukata rather than her usual school uniform, her expression softer and more open than the composed mask she wore during the day. You should be asleep, she said, though there was no real reproach in it. You should have knocked, he replied, though he made no move to stop her as she crossed the room and settled onto the edge of his bed. I did knock. You didn't answer, which told me everything I needed to know. She studied his face in the dim light, her fingers reaching out to brush a strand of hair from his forehead with a tenderness that still, after everything they had been through together, managed to catch him off guard. You're thinking about what Grafia said? Hard not to. I know. She was quiet for a moment, her hand settling against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. Issei, I need you to hear something from me, and I need you to actually listen instead of trying to be brave about it. He turned his head to look at her properly. Okay. Whatever is inside you, whatever ancient thing decided to wake up and whisper in your ear, it does not change who you are to us. It does not change who you are to me. Her voice, usually so playful and teasing, carried a rare and unguarded sincerity. I have watched devils and fallen angels alike destroy themselves chasing power they could not control, twisting into something unrecognizable in the process. I refuse to watch that happen to you. So whatever this becomes, you are not facing it as some vessel for a forbidden dragon. You are facing it as Issei Hyoudou, the idiot who charged headfirst into a fight against Vala Lucifer's team because his friends were in danger, the boy who apologized to a fallen angel's summoned familiar for accidentally stepping on its tail. That is who you are. That does not change because of what's sleeping in your arm. Issei felt something tighten in his throat, a rush of emotion he wasn't entirely prepared for. Akeno, let me finish. She pressed 2 fingers gently to his lips, silencing him, a small smile finally breaking through the seriousness of her expression. I grew up learning that power is dangerous precisely because of what it does to the people who wield it, not because of the power itself. My own father's blood taught me that lesson in ways I would rather not have learned. But you, Issei, you have never once let strength make you cruel, or cold, or distant. That is rarer than you know. It is rare enough that I intend to stay close and make sure it stays that way, no matter what ancient legends Grafia digs up from the underworld archives. He reached up and took her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, an old habit between them that had become something more sincere than playful over the months. Thank you, he said quietly. I mean it. I know you do. She leaned down and pressed her forehead to his, their noses nearly touching, close enough that he could feel her breath against his skin. Now sleep. Tomorrow Bucho will have some plan for training safeguards, I'm certain of it, and you'll need your strength for whatever ridiculous new regimen she comes up with. You're staying? Someone has to make sure you actually rest instead of lying here staring at the ceiling until dawn. She settled beside him, curling against his side with a familiarity that spoke of countless nights like this one, and he felt some of the tension finally begin to drain from his shoulders as her steady presence anchored him back into the present moment, away from ancient dragons and wound-colored skies. He was nearly asleep, lulled by the warmth of her beside him, when her voice came again, soft, and almost hesitant in a way that was unusual for her. Issei. Whatever happens, promise me you'll fight to stay yourself. Not for Bucho's plans, not even for the rest of the peerage. For yourself. I promise, he murmured, already drifting, and if he dreamed that night, he did not remember it, though he woke once near dawn with the phantom sensation of vast wings passing overhead, and the lingering, patient certainty that something ancient was still waiting for him to answer. Morning brought with it a summons to Rias's office before school, where Issei found not only Rias, Akeno, Kiba, and Koneko waiting, but also Asia Argento, seated primly on the couch with a look of worried determination on her face, and beside her, somewhat unexpectedly, Zenobia Corda, arms crossed and a sword resting against her shoulder as though she had come prepared for a fight rather than a meeting. You told them, Issei said to Rias, not quite a question. They're part of this peerage and this family, Rias said simply. They deserve to know what we're facing, especially if it means adjusting how we train and fight together going forward. Asia rose immediately and crossed the room to him, taking both his hands in hers with the same gentle earnestness she brought to everything. Issei-san, are you all right? Does it hurt? I'm okay, Asia, really. He managed a reassuring smile for her benefit, though the worry in her green eyes didn't fully fade. If it starts hurting, even a little, you tell me immediately, she said firmly. I don't care if we're in the middle of training or a raiding game or anything else. Promise me. I promise. Zenobia, for her part, studied him with the appraising look of a warrior assessing a potential threat, though there was concern buried beneath the pragmatism. If this thing inside you decides to wake up during a fight, I want to know what our options are. Restraint. Containment. Whatever it takes to keep you and everyone around you safe until we can find a permanent solution. Nice to know you've already planned for chaining me up, Issei said dryly. I would rather plan and never need it than face an emergency unprepared, Zenobia said without a trace of apology. And Issei supposed that was fair enough, even if it stung a little to hear it spoken so plainly. Rias moved to stand at the head of the room, drawing everyone's attention with the quiet authority she always carried effortlessly. Grafia contacted me again this morning. She and my brother have begun reviewing what records exist on the legend she described, and while they haven't found anything conclusive yet, they've asked that we take precautions in the meantime. Effective immediately, Issei's training will shift focus. Less emphasis on raw boosting, more emphasis on control, on recognizing the early signs of that present stirring, and on techniques that might help suppress it if it begins to surface during combat. So basically I'm benched from getting stronger the normal way, Issei said, unable to keep a note of frustration from his voice. Right before the raiding game against Diodora's group. You're not benched, Rias said firmly. You're being redirected. There's a difference. Kiba, I want you working with him on precision and footwork, techniques that don't rely on stacking boosts recklessly. Koneko, I want you monitoring him during every session. Your senses are the most attuned to that kind of unnatural presence, and I trust your judgment on when something feels wrong before any of the rest of us would notice. Koneko nodded once, solemn and focused, clearly taking the responsibility seriously. Akeno and I will work with him on meditative techniques, Rias continued. Ancient devil families have methods for managing dangerous inherited traits, curses passed down through bloodlines, that sort of thing. They're not perfect, but they may help him recognize the presence before it manifests rather than after. And if none of that works, Zenobia said, and it wakes up mid-battle? Rias's expression hardened slightly. Then we handle it as a peerage, together, the same way we handle every threat that comes for one of our own. I am not going to pretend there's no risk here. But I am also not going to let fear of what might happen stop us from standing beside him while we figure out how to fix it. Issei looked around the room at the faces gathered there, Asia's earnest worry, Zenovia's guarded determination, Kiba's steady calm, Kaneko's quiet focus, Akeno's warm reassurance, and Rias at the center of it all, holding the whole group together through sheer force of will and care. Something in his chest loosened slightly, the crushing weight of the previous night's fear easing just enough to let him breathe properly again. "Thank you," he said quietly, "to all of them. I know this isn't exactly the training regimen anyone signed up for." "We signed up for you," Koneko said simply, matter of fact in the way she always was, and somehow that landed harder than any grand speech could have. Class that day passed in something of a blur, Issei's attention repeatedly drifting despite his best efforts, his mind circling back again and again to the sensation of that voice in his head, the vast dark shape against the wound-colored sky. Matsuda and Motohama noticed his distraction and needled him about it during lunch, convinced he was simply daydreaming about one of the girls in his peerage, an assumption Issei was more than happy to let stand rather than explain the truth. It was during the walk home that afternoon, cutting through the quiet residential streets near the old school building, that Issei felt the first genuine warning signs since the incident in the training hall. It started as a low hum beneath his skin, subtle enough that he almost dismissed it as nerves, but it built steadily as they walked, a pressure gathering behind his eyes and a strange metallic taste creeping across his tongue. Beside him, Koneko went suddenly still, her nose wrinkling. "Issei," she said, low and urgent. "That smell. It's back." "I feel it too," he admitted, slowing his steps, one hand pressing against his temple as the pressure built. "Like something's pushing from the inside." Rias, walking just ahead with Akeno, turned immediately at the tension in Kaneko's voice, her expression sharpening into focus. "Issei. Talk to me. What's happening?" "I don't know, it's not like yesterday, it's smaller, but it's—" He cut himself off with a sharp inhale as the pressure spiked, a wave of cold washing down his left arm, the gauntlet flickering into existence unbidden, its crimson light stuttering at the edges toward that same deep violet black. "Partner." Drake's voice was tight with urgency. "It's testing the boundaries again. Breathe. Focus on my voice, not the other one. Do not let it pull your attention." Trying, Issei gritted out through clenched teeth, sinking to one knee on the sidewalk as the world seemed to tilt sideways for a moment, the ordinary street around him briefly overlaid with that impossible wound-colored sky, vast wings blotting out what should have been sunlight. Rias was at his side in an instant, kneeling beside him, one hand pressed firmly against his shoulder, grounding him with sheer physical presence. "Issei, look at me. Focus on me. You are here, on this street, with me, not wherever that thing is trying to pull your mind." He forced his eyes to find hers, crimson and steady and utterly unwavering, an anchor point in the swirling disorientation gripping him. Slowly, gradually, the pressure behind his eyes began to recede, the metallic taste fading, the gauntlet's light steadying back into its familiar, reassuring crimson. "There you go," Rias murmured, her hand not leaving his shoulder even as the crisis passed. "That's it. Stay with me." It took several long moments before Issei's breathing evened out completely, the ordinary street reasserting itself fully around him, late afternoon sunlight slanting gold through the trees exactly as it should. He became aware, gradually, of the small crowd that had formed around him, Akeno kneeling on his other side with a hand pressed against his back, Koneko standing tense and alert a few feet away scanning the surrounding area as though expecting an attack, Kiba and the others having caught up and formed a loose protective circle without anyone needing to give the order. "I'm okay," Issei said finally, his voice hoarse. "I think it passed." "That happened without any boosting at all," Kiba observed grimly. "You weren't even using the gear when it started. Which means proximity to strong emotion or stress alone might be enough to trigger it now," Rias said, her expression troubled. "That complicates things considerably." Zenovia crouched down to Issei's level, studying his face with sharp assessment. "How do you feel right now, in this moment?" "Be honest." "Tired," Issei admitted. "Like I just ran a marathon. But normal otherwise." "It's gone for now." For now, Zenobia repeated, and the words hung heavy in the air, an acknowledgement that whatever reprieve they'd just witnessed was temporary at best. Rias helped him to his feet, keeping a steadying hand on his arm even once he'd found his balance. We're going straight back to the club room. I want to contact Grafia again immediately and report this development. Twice in 2 days is not a pattern any of us can afford to ignore. The walk back passed in tense silence, the peerage forming an unconscious perimeter around Issei as they moved, alert to any further sign of trouble. Issei kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight, wrestling with a fear he hadn't quite let himself acknowledge until that moment on the sidewalk, that whatever slept inside him was not content to remain sleeping, and that every day that passed brought it closer to fully waking, regardless of what precautions anyone tried to put in place. Drake, sensing the direction of his thoughts, spoke quietly, for his ears alone. Partner, I will not lie to you and tell you this will be simple. But I have carried burdens across centuries and hosts, and I have never once abandoned a partner to face one alone. Whatever comes, you fight it with my strength behind yours, for as long as I am able to lend it. Thanks, Drake, Issei murmured under his breath. I mean it. Do not thank me yet, the dragon said, something grim underlying his usual confidence. Thank me once we have won. They reached the old school building as the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, the sky bleeding orange and red in a way that, for one uncomfortable moment, reminded Issei uncomfortably of the wound-colored sky he'd glimpsed twice now in the space of 2 days. He pushed the thought away as they climbed the stairs toward the club room, toward Rias's summoning circle and whatever news Grafia might have uncovered in the archives of the underworld, and told himself, with a determination that felt more solid than it had any right to after the day he'd had, that he would find a way through this. He always had before. He would again. He had to. Grafia's report that evening carried grim confirmation of what everyone had already begun to suspect. The archives in the underworld held only fragments regarding the ashworm, scattered references buried in texts so old that even devil scholars argued over their proper translation, but one detail emerged with disturbing consistency across every source she had managed to locate. The seal weakened in proportion to the host's own power and resolve. In simpler terms, Grafia explained, her image steady within the summoning circle, the very qualities that make Issei Sama an exceptional wielder of the boosted gear, his determination, his refusal to accept limits, his growth and strength, are the same qualities accelerating the weakening of whatever binds that ancient power in place. The more he pushes himself to become stronger through sheer will, the more strain is placed on the seal. So the solution is what? Issei asked. I stopped trying? Just accept being weak forever so this thing stays asleep. No, Grafia said firmly. Suppressing your own growth would likely cause as many problems as it solves, both for your development as a devil and, more immediately, for your ability to survive the conflicts already approaching, including the raiding game against Lord Diodora's peerage. What the archives suggest instead is a different approach. Rather than restraining your strength, we need to strengthen the seal itself, reinforcing it through deliberate technique rather than leaving it to hold against the growing pressure it was never designed to withstand indefinitely. And how do we do that? Rias asked, arms crossed, already calculating contingencies behind her steady expression. There are meditative and ritual techniques, passed down among the oldest devil bloodlines, originally developed to help control cursed or unstable inherited traits, Grafia said. They will not be easy to learn, and they will require consistent practice, likely daily, for the foreseeable future. But if applied correctly, they should allow Issei Sama to actively reinforce the seal each time he uses the gear, rather than simply eroding it further with every boost. I'll do it, Issei said immediately, without hesitation. Whatever it takes, however long it takes. Just tell me where to start. Grafia's expression softened almost imperceptibly, something like approval flickering across her otherwise composed features. Your resolve is noted, Issei Sama, and it is precisely that resolve which gives me confidence this can be managed. I will send written instructions for the initial meditative forms within the hour. Rias Sama, I would recommend having Akeno-san assist, given her own experience with controlling volatile inherited power. Her family's line carries similar challenges, and she may have insight the written instructions alone cannot provide. Akeno's expression flickered briefly at the mention of her own bloodline, an old wound touched lightly, but she nodded without complaint. I'll help however I can. Thank you, Rias said, addressing Graphia. Please pass along our gratitude to my brother as well, for the resources being dedicated to this. Of course, Rias-sama. I will contact you again as soon as further information becomes available. The circle dimmed, and Graphia's image faded, leaving the club room in a thoughtful quiet. The days that followed settled into a new and demanding rhythm. Mornings began before dawn with Akeno guiding Issei through breathing exercises and meditative forms drawn from her family's own methods of managing inherited power, techniques that required a stillness and internal focus entirely different from the aggressive, forward momentum he usually brought to training. He struggled with it initially, his restless energy chafing against the demand for quiet control, but Akeno proved a patient teacher, her usual teasing set aside in favor of genuine, careful instruction. The mistake most people make, she told him, on their third morning session, both of them seated cross-legged on the clubroom floor as pale light crept through the windows, is treating power like something to be seized and dominated through force alone. That works for a while. It even feels satisfying, feeling something bend to your will through sheer determination. But eventually you meet something that force alone cannot subdue, and if force is the only tool you've ever practiced, you have nothing left to fall back on. So what's the alternative? Partnership, she said simply. Not domination. You don't wrestle the sea into stillness. You learn its rhythms, and you move with them, until eventually the sea itself carries you rather than fighting you every stroke of the way. She reached over and adjusted his posture slightly, her fingers cool against his shoulder. The seal inside you isn't something to be crushed down through willpower. It needs to be acknowledged, understood, and worked with, even as you keep it contained. Does that make sense? Sort of, Issei admitted. Feels a lot harder than just boosting until something breaks. It is harder, she agreed, with a small, knowing smile. Anything worth doing usually is. Afternoons brought sparring sessions with Kiba, focused now on precision rather than raw power, footwork and timing, and the kind of controlled technique that let a smaller advantage compound into victory without ever needing to lean on a full boost sequence. Kiba proved surprisingly patient as a teacher, methodical in his corrections, and Issei found himself grudgingly grateful for the shift in focus even as his instincts screamed at him to simply overpower every challenge the way he always had before. You rely on the boost as a crutch, Kiba told him, during one particularly frustrating session where Issei had been disarmed 3 times in a row. It's not a bad instinct, given what the gear grants you, but it means your fundamentals have never had to develop properly. Most fighters your age would kill for the raw power you already carry. Few of them would trade it for the discipline you're building right now, but I think you'll find it makes you far more dangerous in the long run. Feels like I'm starting from scratch. You are, in a sense, Kiba said, not unkindly. But you're starting from scratch with instincts sharpened by real combat experience already, which is more than most people ever get. Trust the process. Koneko, true to Rias's instructions, remained a near constant presence during every session, her sharp senses attuned to the faintest hint of that unnatural cold, or the metallic tang that preceded the present stirring. On 2 separate occasions during the first week she caught the earliest warning signs before Issei himself had even registered them, calling a halt to training with a single sharp word that had become their agreed signal, allowing him to center himself through Akeno's breathing techniques before the pressure could build into anything worse than a passing chill. You're getting better at catching it early, Issei told her, during a break on the 5th day, both of them sitting on the training hall steps while Kiba and Akeno discussed the next phase of his regimen nearby. Not better, Koneko said. Just paying attention. Anyone could do it if they tried hard enough. I don't think that's true, but thanks anyway. She glanced at him sideways, an unusually thoughtful expression crossing her normally stoic features. You're not scared enough, she said finally. Issei blinked, caught off guard by the observation. What do you mean? I'm plenty scared, believe me. Scared of the thing inside you. Not scared enough of pushing yourself too hard trying to beat it through effort alone. She popped a piece of Pocky into her mouth, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. You keep training like it's a normal problem you can just work harder to solve. But Akeno keeps saying it's not about force. You should actually listen to her instead of just nodding along. The blunt honesty landed harder than any lecture could have, and Issei found himself sitting with the observation for a long moment before responding. You're right, he admitted. I keep falling back into old habits. Old ways of thinking. I'll try to do better. Good, Koneko said, satisfied, and returned her attention to her Pocky as though the conversation had never happened, though Issei noticed her watching him with slightly closer attention for the rest of that session, as though checking whether the lesson had actually taken hold. By the end of the first week, the meditative techniques Akeno had been teaching him began, gradually, to show results. The pressure behind his eyes that had marked the present stirring grew less frequent, the cold sensation less severe when it did occur, and twice during controlled sparring sessions Issei managed to catch the earliest flicker of that violet-black light himself, before Koneko had even needed to call the warning, and successfully guided back into the familiar crimson through the breathing patterns Akeno had drilled into him. You're improving faster than I expected, Rias told him, during a rare quiet evening in the club room, the two of them alone while the rest of the peerage attended to other errands. She sat beside him on the couch, close enough that her shoulder brushed his, a cup of tea cooling untouched on the table before her. Grafia's techniques seem to be working. Akeno's a good teacher, Issei said. Better than I expected, honestly. Not that I doubted her, just, I didn't realize how much patience this whole thing would require. She's had to learn patience the hard way, with her own inheritance, Rias said quietly. I think teaching you has been good for her too, in a way. A chance to use what she learned managing her own power to help someone else, rather than just enduring it alone the way she had to for so long. Issei considered that for a moment, thinking of Akeno's careful instruction, the genuine warmth beneath her usual teasing exterior whenever she guided him through the breathing forms. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'm glad, if it's helping her too. Rias was quiet for a moment, studying the surface of her tea rather than looking at him directly. Issei, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not to reassure me, but because I actually need to know. Okay. Are you afraid? She asked. Of what's happening. Of what might still happen, if the seal doesn't hold, or if we run out of time before the raiding game. He considered the question seriously, aware that she deserved a real answer rather than the easy bravado he might have offered a week earlier. Yeah, he admitted finally. I am. Not just for me, either. I keep thinking about what Grafia said, about it unmaking everyone around me if it wakes up fully. That's the part that actually scares me, more than anything happening to myself. That's an honest answer, Rias said softly. Thank you for trusting me with it. Of course I trust you, Issei said, surprised she'd even feel the need to ask. You're the reason any of this is manageable at all. You, Akeno, Koneko, everyone. I wouldn't be handling this half as well without all of you around me. Rias looked up at him then, something warm and unguarded in her crimson eyes that made his breath catch slightly. We're not going anywhere, she said simply. Whatever this becomes, however long it takes to find a lasting solution, you have all of us, for as long as you need us. That's not a burden, Issei. It's a choice we're making, every one of us, because you matter to this family. He didn't trust himself to speak for a moment, the sincerity in her words settling somewhere deep in his chest alongside the lingering fear he just admitted to carrying. Eventually he managed a quiet, thank you, Bucho, and she smiled at him, small and genuine, before reaching over to finally take a sip of her cooling tea, the moment settling into a comfortable silence that neither of them felt any particular need to break. It was 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon that began ordinarily enough, that the peerage's careful preparations were tested for the first time against a real threat rather than a controlled training scenario. The report came through Rias's familiar in the middle of the school day, an urgent summons regarding a stray devil that had gone rogue in the industrial district on the edge of town, one that had already injured 2 humans before local exorcist contacts flagged it as beyond their jurisdiction and passed the matter along to the devils with territorial claim over the area. Rias gathered the peerage immediately after the final bell, her expression grim and focused. This isn't a training exercise, she told them, as they made their way toward the summoning point Grafia had arranged. This stray has already drawn blood and shows no sign of stopping. We handle it quickly and decisively. Issei felt the familiar tightening of nerves as they approached, but beneath it, for the first time in over a week, something steadier, a quiet confidence built from days of disciplined training rather than the reckless bravado he'd relied on before. He flexed his left hand, feeling the gauntlet respond faithfully, its light steady and crimson, and reminded himself of Akeno's lessons: breathe, acknowledge, work with rather than against. The stray devil, when they found it, had taken up residence in an abandoned warehouse, its form a grotesque fusion of insectoid limbs and a distorted, elongated torso that had once, presumably, been human before its transformation twisted it into something else entirely. It shrieked upon sensing their approach, skittering across the rafters with unnerving speed, and the fight that followed was fast and brutal, Kiba's blade flashing silver as he darted between strikes, Koneko's enhanced strength shattering support beams as she drove the creature back, Akeno's lightning crackling through the warehouse's dim interior in bright, controlled bursts. Issei fought at Rias's side, his boosts measured and deliberate rather than stacked recklessly, each activation accompanied by the steady mental discipline Akeno had drilled into him, an acknowledgement of the power surging through him rather than a blind demand for more. When the pressure began building behind his eyes partway through the fight, the telltale sign of the presence stirring in response to his rising adrenaline, he recognized it immediately, and rather than panicking, drew on the breathing patterns automatically, folding the sensation back down even as he continued fighting, barely breaking stride. Issei, status, Rias called, even as she loosed a blast of destruction magic that sent the stray devil reeling. Handling it, he called back, and meant it, landing a solid boosted strike that finally brought the creature crashing down for Kiba to finish cleanly. The fight ended minutes later, the stray devil's essence dissolving into nothing as Rias delivered the final blow, and the warehouse fell quiet except for the peerage's collective heavy breathing and the faint crackle of dissipating magic. Issei straightened, checking himself over automatically, and found, with a rush of quiet relief, that the presence remained settled, contained, the crimson light of his gauntlet steady and unbroken throughout. You held it, Koneko observed, appearing at his side, sniffing the air briefly before nodding, satisfied. No cold. No wrong smell. You actually held it. I actually held it, Issei repeated, something like disbelief coloring his own voice as the reality settled in. A full combat scenario, real stakes, genuine adrenaline, and the seal had stayed intact throughout, reinforced rather than eroded by the training he'd poured himself into over the past week and a half. Rias crossed the warehouse floor to join them, her expression a mixture of relief and quiet pride. That's real progress, she said. Real, measurable progress. Graphia's techniques are working, and you're applying them exactly as you should. Feels good to actually succeed at something for once, instead of just surviving another close call, Issei admitted, allowing himself a tired but genuine grin. Akeno approached from the other side, lightning still crackling faintly at her fingertips as the last of her magic dissipated, and pressed a light kiss to his cheek, unbothered by the rest of the peerage watching. I'm proud of you, she said simply. You listened. You actually listened, and it worked. Had a good teacher, he said, and meant every word of it. Kiba clapped him on the shoulder as he passed, a rare, warm smile crossing his usually composed features. Well fought, he said simply, and it meant more coming from Kiba than a longer speech might have from anyone else. As they made their way back out of the warehouse and into the cool evening air, the sky overhead deepening into twilight without the ominous wound-colored tint that had haunted Issei's vision twice now, he allowed himself, for the first time in over a week, a genuine sense of hope. The road ahead was clearly far from finished, the raiding game against Diodora's peerage still looming, the full scope of what the Ashworm's legend might ultimately mean for him still unknown. But for the first time since that first flicker of black light in the training hall, he believed, truly believed, that this was a fight he could actually win, provided he kept trusting the people who had chosen, without hesitation, to stand beside him through it. Somewhere deep beneath his own thoughts, in the space where that ancient presence continued to wait, patient and coiled, Issei thought he felt something almost like acknowledgement, a grudging respect for the discipline that had, for now, kept the door closed against it. It did not speak again that evening. But it did not fully retreat either, and Issei understood, with a clarity that settled over him like the coming night, that this was only ever going to be a truce, not a victory, and that somewhere ahead, on a day and in a circumstance none of them could yet predict, the true test of everything he was building now still waited for him. He walked home surrounded by his peerage, by the people who had become, in every way that mattered, his family, and told himself that whatever came next, he would not face it unprepared, and he would not face it alone. The week leading up to the rating game against Diodora Astaroth's peerage passed in a blur of intensified preparation, the ordinary rhythms of school life folding almost entirely into the background as Rias drilled her peerage through strategy sessions late into the evenings. Issei found himself splitting his focus between combat readiness and the continued meditative discipline Akeno had instilled in him, determined not to let the pressure of the coming match undo the fragile stability he'd built over the past 2 weeks. Diodora's peerage favors overwhelming numbers and coordinated illusion tactics, Rias explained, standing before a projected map of the battlefield terrain Graphia had provided ahead of the match. He's young, arrogant, and prone to underestimating opponents he considers beneath his family's standing, which works in our favor if we can bait him into overcommitting early. But do not mistake his arrogance for incompetence. His bishop alone has been responsible for 3 consecutive victories through illusion work sophisticated enough to fool even experienced devils. So we don't trust anything we see, Kiba said. Exactly. Koneko, your senses will matter more than ever in this match, smell and instinct over sight, since illusion magic can deceive the eyes far more easily than it can fool a nose. Rias's gaze moved around the room, settling briefly on each member of her peerage in turn. Issei, I want you paired with me for the opening phase. If your control holds under real match pressure the way it did against the stray devil, your boosted strikes paired with my destruction magic should be able to punch through most defensive formations his peerage can construct. And if my control doesn't hold? Issei asked, voicing the fear that had been sitting quietly at the back of his mind all week. Rias met his eyes steadily. Then we adapt, the same way we always have. I have faith in the progress you've made. But I also have contingencies in place regardless, because that is simply good strategy, not a lack of faith in you. The reassurance settled something in his chest, even as the underlying tension of the coming match continued to build. That night, after the strategy session concluded and the rest of the peerage had dispersed for rest, Issei lingered in the club room, staring out the window at the darkened school grounds below, his mind circling restlessly around everything that could go wrong. You're thinking too loudly, Koneko said, appearing at his elbow with her characteristic quiet suddenness. I could hear it from the hallway. Sorry, he said, managing a tired smile. Just running through everything that could go wrong tomorrow. Don't, she said simply. You've trained. You've held it under real pressure once already. Trust that instead of imagining every disaster before it happens. Easier said than done. Most useful things are. She settled onto the windowsill beside him, her golden eyes reflecting the pale moonlight outside. Issei, can I ask you something? Of course. When that thing spoke to you, the ash worm, or whatever it actually is, what did it feel like? Not the cold, not the pressure. What did it actually feel like, underneath all that? Issei considered the question seriously, surprised as always by the depth Koneko brought to conversations she chose to actually engage in. Lonely, he said finally, the word surfacing before he'd fully consciously chosen it. It felt lonely. Like something that had been waiting a really long time for someone to actually listen to it, and it didn't much care whether that someone had good intentions or not, as long as they finally paid attention. Koneko was quiet for a long moment, processing that. That's sad, she said eventually. Doesn't make it less dangerous. But it's sad. Yeah, Issei agreed softly. I thought so too. Don't let it use that against you, she said more firmly now. Loneliness can make dangerous things feel sympathetic. Doesn't mean they stop being dangerous. I know. I won't. He glanced over at her, something warm settling in his chest despite the heaviness of the conversation. Thanks for checking on me, Koneko. Someone has to, she said, with the faintest ghost of a smile, before hopping down from the windowsill and heading for the door. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long. She was right, of course. Tomorrow was going to be long, and as Issei finally made his way home through the quiet night streets, he found himself hoping, with a fervency that surprised him, that the peace he'd found over the past 2 weeks would hold for just one more day, one more match, one more test standing between himself and whatever ancient power continued to wait, patient and coiled, beneath the surface of his own thoughts. The raiding game arena materialized around them the following afternoon in a burst of transitional light, resolving into a sprawling forest terrain dense with old-growth trees and rocky outcroppings, the kind of environment that favored ambush tactics and mobility over open confrontation. Rias's peerage spread into their opening formation immediately, Kiba melting into the tree line to scout ahead, Koniko's nose already working to cut through whatever illusions Diodora's peerage might already be weaving into the terrain. "Report," Rias called quietly, once they'd established a defensible position near a rocky outcrop. 2 of his pawns to the northeast, maybe 400 meters, Kiba reported, reappearing at the edge of their position. "Standard formation, nothing unusual yet. His bishop's presence is harder to pin down. I can feel the illusion work building somewhere ahead, but I can't localize the source." "Understood. We move northeast, draw the pawns into an engagement before the bishop's illusions have time to fully establish across a wider area." Rias's tactical focus was absolute now, every trace of the softer, more vulnerable moments from the previous evening folded away beneath the composed authority of a peerage leader preparing for battle. "Issei, stay close. Akeno, range support from the flank? Koneko, Zenobia, you're our front line alongside Issei. Kiba, continue scouting ahead and warn us the moment anything shifts." The engagement, when it came, unfolded quickly and violently, Diodora's 2 pawns proving more resilient than their initial positioning had suggested, absorbing several of Zenobia's sword strikes and Koniko's enhanced blows before finally falling to a coordinated assault. Issei fought at Rias's side exactly as planned, his boosts measured and controlled, the meditative discipline holding steady even as adrenaline surged through the chaos of combat. It was in the aftermath of that first engagement, as the peerage regrouped to press deeper into the forest, that the illusions finally began in earnest. The trees around them seemed to shift and multiply, the terrain folding in on itself in ways that defied ordinary geography, and Issei felt a wave of disorientation wash over the group as familiar landmarks blurred and doubled. Somewhere ahead, laughter echoed through the illusory forest, light and mocking, unmistakably belonging to Diodora Astaroth himself. "Impressive discipline you've shown so far," Diodora's voice called out, seeming to come from every direction at once, the illusion work distorting its true source. "I confess I expected less from the Gremory heiress's collection of stray pieces. But discipline only carries a peerage so far against true artistry." "Ignore the taunting," Rias said quietly. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the shifting trees for any sign of the actual threat. "Koneko, can you find the real path through this?" Koneko's nose wrinkled, working through layers of illusory scent overlaying the forest air, and after a tense moment she pointed decisively toward what appeared to be a solid rock face. "There. The real forest continues past that. Everything else here is false." They moved as one, Rias leading the charge through the illusory barrier, and the moment they broke through, the true battlefield resolved around them, Diodora's bishop standing atop a rocky rise with the arrogant satisfaction of someone accustomed to their tricks working exactly as intended, flanked by 2 more pawns and a knight already moving to intercept. The fight that followed was faster and more chaotic than the first, illusions continuing to flicker at the edges of Issei's vision even as the real combat unfolded, the bishop weaving deceptive afterimages of allies and enemies alike into the chaos to sow confusion. Issei found himself relying more and more heavily on Koneko's sharp calls to distinguish reality from illusion, trusting her senses over his own increasingly unreliable eyes. It was in the middle of that disorienting chaos, as he boosted forward to intercept a strike aimed at Akeno's exposed flank, that Issei felt the pressure begin building behind his eyes again, sharper and faster than it had during the stray devil encounter, the accumulated stress of illusion and combat and adrenaline compounding in a way the earlier, more controlled training sessions hadn't fully prepared him for. Not now, he thought desperately, even as he continued fighting, his movements growing marginally less precise as he tried to simultaneously manage the presence stirring within him and track the shifting chaos of the illusion-soaked battlefield around him. Please, not now. The dragon's voice cut through his rising panic, steady and firm. Breathe, partner. You know this. You have held it before under real pressure. This is no different. Trust what Akeno taught you. Issei forced himself to focus on the breathing pattern even as he parried a strike from one of Daidora's pawns, folding the rising pressure back down through sheer disciplined effort, and for a moment it seemed to be working, the metallic taste receding, the cold sensation in his arm fading back toward manageable levels. Then the bishop's illusion work found its true target. A wave of distorted, layered images crashed over the battlefield all at once, dozens of false Rias, false Akeno, false Koneko flickering into and out of existence around him, indistinguishable from the real members of his peerage fighting somewhere in the chaos. And Issei felt a genuine spike of panic override his careful discipline as he lost track, for one critical moment, of which figures were real and which were illusory constructs meant to confuse and mislead. Rias! He shouted, his voice raw with fear as he watched what might have been the real Rias take a heavy blow from Daidora's knight. Though he couldn't be certain, the image flickering uncertainly at the edges in a way that could have been illusion or could have been genuine injury. The pressure behind his eyes surged violently in response to the sudden spike of fear and confusion, and this time it did not recede at his attempt to control it. The gauntlet's light stuttered, crimson bleeding rapidly toward that deep violet black, and the temperature around him plummeted in an instant, frost crawling across the forest floor in a widening ring as the world around him seemed to tilt sideways, the illusion-soaked battlefield overlaying, for one terrible moment, with that vast dark shape unfurling wings against the wound-colored sky. Boy! The voice was louder now than it had ever been before, filling the space where his own thoughts should have been. You are afraid for them. Good. Fear sharpens what determination alone cannot. Let me show you what real strength looks like. Let me protect them the way you cannot, not like this, not with these fragile human limits still clinging to you. No, Issei managed to gasp aloud, even as the cold continued spreading up his arm, his vision doubling violently between the illusion-soaked forest and that impossible other sky. I don't need you. I have them. I have my own strength. Your strength is not enough. It has never been enough. Not against a real threat, and you know it. I can feel your doubt even now. Let go. Let me finish this before someone you love pays the price for your limitations. Somewhere distant, through the roaring confusion in his own head, Issei heard Koneko's voice, sharp and urgent, calling his name, and Akeno's voice layered over it, both of them closing distance toward him even as the frost continued spreading and the violet-black light around his gauntlet pulsed with growing, hungry intensity. Drake's voice cut through the chaos, desperate now in a way Issei had never heard from the dragon before. Partner, fight it, do not let it convince you that surrender is strength. That is the oldest lie there is. I have heard it whispered to hosts before you and it has never once ended well. Hold on just a little longer. The violet-black light flared, bright enough to cast strange, shifting shadows across the illusion-soaked battlefield, and somewhere within that terrible cold, Issei felt something ancient and vast finally begin to stir, fully awake for the first time, testing the boundaries of a seal that 2 weeks of disciplined training had reinforced but never fully hardened against a moment exactly like this one, a moment of genuine, overwhelming fear for the people he loved most. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath, and then, through the roaring confusion, he felt a hand close around his, small and cold and utterly familiar, and Koneko's voice, no longer distant but right beside him, cut through everything else with startling clarity. Issei. Look at me. Not at it. Me. He forced his eyes to focus, through the doubled vision and the violet-black light and the terrible cold, on her face, close enough now that he could see the fierce, unwavering determination in her golden eyes, and something in that focus, that simple, insistent presence, gave him an anchor point strong enough to grasp onto. We're right here, she said, her grip on his hand tightening. All of us. Real. Not illusions. Real. You don't need to let it out to protect us. You already are protecting us, just by staying yourself. The violet-black light flickered, wavered, and for one suspended, terrible moment, hung balanced between two outcomes neither of them could fully predict. The violet-black light flickered, wavered, and for one suspended, terrible moment, hung balanced between two outcomes neither of them could fully predict. Koneko did not let go of his hand. "You don't need it," she said again, her voice steady even as frost continued crawling up her sleeve from where her skin touched his. "Look around you. Really look. Nobody here is hurt because you failed. Nobody here needs you to become something else to keep them safe. We're already safe. Because of you as you are." Issei forced his doubled vision to focus, past the wound-colored sky and the vast dark wings, back onto the small, cold hand gripping his, back onto the golden eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that refused to look away. Somewhere behind her he could make out Akeno closing the distance at a dead run, lightning crackling protectively around her, and beyond that, Rias, very much alive, very much real, driving Diodora's knight back with a blast of destruction magic, her crimson hair whipping around her as she fought. Not an illusion. Not a casualty of his failure. Simply Rias, exactly where she had always been, fighting exactly as hard as she always fought, because that was who she was, with or without whatever ancient power clawed at the inside of his own skull. "Your strength is not enough," the voice pressed again, quieter now, uncertain in a way it hadn't been a moment before. "I can feel you slipping away from me. Why? Why refuse what I offer, when it would end all of this so easily?" "Because ending it isn't the point," Issei said, and found, as he said it, that his voice had steadied, the words settling into a certainty he hadn't fully possessed until the moment he spoke them aloud. "I don't want it easy. I want it mine. My strength, earned the hard way, with people who chose to stand next to me while I built it. That's worth more than anything you're offering." The violet-black light guttered, like a candle flame caught in a sudden wind, and then, with a final shudder that Issei felt travel the length of his arm and settle somewhere deep in his chest, it collapsed back into the familiar, steady crimson of the boosted gear, the cold retreating so quickly that the frost on the ground around them began steaming faintly in the humid forest air. "Partner." Drake's voice returned, exhausted but present, unmistakably relieved. "Well done. Well done." Issei sagged, his knees threatening to buckle, and Koneko's grip on his hand tightened to keep him upright even as Akeno arrived at his other side, her own hand pressed flat against his back, steadying him from that direction as well. "I'm okay," he managed, before either of them could ask. "It's gone." "I held it." "You held it," Akeno repeated, something fierce and proud breaking through the worry on her face. "You actually held it, in the middle of a real fight, with everything falling apart around you." Ahead of them, the sound of combat continued, Rias and Zenobia pressing their advantage against Diodora's remaining knight while Kiba circled to cut off any retreat, the tide of the engagement clearly turning in their favor now that the bishop's most elaborate illusion work had failed to produce whatever catastrophic result Diodora had apparently been hoping to provoke. "Go," Issei said, straightening despite the lingering weakness in his legs. "Help them finish this. I can still fight." Koneko studied him for a moment longer, checking, he suspected, for any lingering trace of that unnatural cold or wrong smell, before nodding once, satisfied. "Stay close," she said. "Don't push past what you have left." The three of them moved together back into the fray, and Issei found, as he rejoined the fight, that something had genuinely shifted within him, a quiet confidence settling into his chest that had nothing to do with raw power and everything to do with having faced the worst version of that internal test and come through it intact. His boosts, when he called them, felt cleaner somehow, more fully his own, and the strike he landed against Diodora's knight carried a weight that sent the armored figure crashing back through a stand of illusion-soaked trees hard enough to shatter the deception entirely, revealing the true rocky clearing beneath. Diodora Astaroth's composure finally cracked as his forces crumbled around him, his earlier mocking confidence giving way to genuine alarm as Rias advanced on his position with clear, focused intent, her destruction magic gathering in a steady crimson glow at her palm. "This isn't how this was supposed to go," Diodora said, backing away, his voice losing its earlier smugness. "The Ashworm was supposed to." He cut himself off, but not before the words registered fully across the peerage. You knew, Rias said, her voice suddenly very cold, her advance halting entirely. You knew about the ashworm. You engineered this match specifically to provoke it. Diodora's expression shifted, calculation replacing panic, though it was too late to hide what he'd already revealed. Word travels, Gremory. Certain interested parties have been watching your pawn's development with considerable interest for some time now. I merely thought I might be the one to see what he becomes, when properly encouraged. Encouraged, Issei repeated, stepping forward despite Koneko's restraining hand on his arm, fury sharpening his voice. You mean you tried to get me to lose control on purpose? In the middle of a raiding game? With people who could have been hurt? A calculated risk, Diodora said, with a thin, unpleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes. One that, regrettably, did not pay off as anticipated. No matter. There will be other opportunities. There won't, Rias said, and the destruction magic gathered at her palm flared brighter, sharp enough that Diodora's remaining forces instinctively fell back a step. This match is over. You've lost, decisively, and you've revealed considerably more than you intended to in the process. My family will hear about this, in detail. Diodora's composure wavered further, the reality of his position finally settling in fully, and after a long, tense moment, he raised a hand in the formal gesture of concession, his expression twisted with barely concealed frustration. The match is yours, Gremory. For now. The arena dissolved around them in a wash of transitional light moments later, the illusion-soaked forest fading back into the ordinary, familiar space of the raiding game observation chamber, and Issei found himself blinking against the sudden shift in lighting, still processing the adrenaline crash and the lingering weight of everything that had just happened. Rias turned to him immediately, her earlier icy focus dissolving into open, unguarded concern as she crossed the chamber to stand before him, both hands coming up to cup his face, checking him over with the same thoroughness she might have applied to a physical wound. Talk to me? Really talk to me? Are you all right? I'm all right, he said, and this time it was closer to the truth than it had been after the first two incidents, a genuine, if exhausted, steadiness underlying the words. It was close. Closer than either of the other times. But I held it. Koneko helped me hold it. Rias's gaze shifted to Koneko, something profound and grateful passing across her expression. Thank you, she said simply. I don't have adequate words for what that was worth. Koneko shrugged, though a faint flush colored her cheeks at the direct praise. I just told him the truth. That we were real. That he didn't need to become something else to protect us. She glanced at Issei, her golden eyes softening slightly. He's the one who chose to believe it. Akeno, still close at Issei's side, pressed her forehead lightly against his shoulder, a wordless gesture of relief that he felt more than saw. Diodora knew, she said quietly, straightening after a moment, her earlier fear giving way to a simmering anger of her own. He deliberately provoked this, knowing what could have happened, knowing people could have been hurt. That's not something we can simply let go unanswered. Agreed, Rias said, her voice hardening again as her strategic mind clearly began turning over the implications of what Diodora had let slip. He mentioned interested parties watching Issei's development. That means this isn't isolated. Someone beyond Diodora himself knows about the ashworm, and knows enough to view Issei as a potential asset, or a potential weapon, worth manipulating into an uncontrolled awakening. The weight of that realization settled heavily over the group, the relief of having survived the immediate crisis tempering quickly into a new, more complicated kind of concern. Issei felt Drake stir within the gauntlet, the dragon's presence carrying a grim wariness that matched the mood in the room. Partner, Drake said for his ears alone. This complicates matters considerably. If word of the ashworm's presence within you has already reached years beyond your own peerage and Graphia's careful discretion, then we are no longer dealing solely with an internal struggle to master something ancient and dangerous. We are dealing with external forces who may see that danger as an opportunity rather than a threat to be managed. Great, Issei muttered under his breath, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. As if one ancient world-ending dragon wasn't enough to deal with. Rias, apparently catching enough of his muttered tone to guess the general sentiment, offered a small, tired smile of her own. We'll handle it, she said, with the same unwavering confidence she'd carried through every crisis since he'd first joined her peerage. One thread at a time. Right now, you've earned some genuine rest, and we've earned a victory, however complicated the circumstances turned out to be. The debrief that followed back at the clubroom stretched well into the evening, Rias contacting Grafia immediately to report both the match's outcome and Diodora's damning admission, the news clearly troubling enough that Grafia promised to escalate the matter directly to Surzex himself rather than handling it through the usual channels. Issei sat through most of the conversation in a haze of exhaustion, the adrenaline crash finally catching up with him fully, his peerage arranged around him in the clubroom with the particular closeness of people who had just watched something genuinely frightening resolve safely, and weren't quite ready to fully relax their guard yet. You should eat something and sleep, Asia said, appearing at his side with a plate of onigiri she'd apparently prepared while the rest of them debriefed, her green eyes still faintly red-rimmed from the anxious hours spent waiting for news of the match's outcome. You look exhausted. Thanks, Asia, he said, accepting the plate gratefully, only realizing as the first bite hit his tongue how genuinely hungry he was. Sorry you had to sit through all that worrying. I'd rather worry and know what's happening than be kept in the dark, she said firmly, settling onto the couch beside him. Please don't ever try to protect me by keeping me out of things like this. It doesn't help. It just makes the worrying worse, not knowing. I won't, he promised and meant it. Zenobia, leaning against the wall near the window with her arms crossed, spoke up from across the room, her tone characteristically blunt. For what it's worth, that was the closest call I've seen in a fight since we took on Kokobile. If Koneko hadn't reached you when she did, I'm not certain how that would have ended. I'm aware, Issei said, glancing toward Koneko, who had settled into her usual armchair near the door, Pocky in hand as though the afternoon's crisis hadn't happened at all, though the careful way she kept glancing toward him suggested her composure was, at least partially, a deliberate performance for everyone else's benefit. We need better contingencies, Zenobia continued. Not just meditation techniques and careful monitoring. If external forces are actively trying to provoke this awakening, we need to plan for scenarios where the trigger comes from somewhere we don't anticipate, in a place where Koneko or Akeno might not be close enough to intervene in time. She's right, Rias said, her expression thoughtful. We've been treating this as an internal challenge to manage through discipline and training. That's still necessary, but it's no longer sufficient on its own. We need to think about this as a security concern as well, one with external actors actively working against us. Kiba, who had been quiet for most of the debrief, spoke up from his position near the bookshelf. Do we have any sense of who these interested parties might actually be? Diodora didn't strike me as someone with the resources or connections to orchestrate something like this entirely on his own initiative. No, Rias admitted. Which is precisely what concerns me. Diodora is ambitious, but he's also young and relatively unproven within his own family's standing. The idea that he'd risk a raiding game, and the political consequences of losing one so publicly, purely on his own initiative seems unlikely. Someone more influential may have encouraged this, whether directly or through more subtle means. The conversation continued for a while longer, strategies and contingencies discussed in increasingly practical detail, but Issei found his attention drifting despite his best efforts, exhaustion finally winning out over the adrenaline that had carried him through the afternoon's crisis. Akeno noticed first, her hand settling gently on his shoulder. I think that's enough planning for tonight, she said, addressing Rias directly. He needs rest more than he needs to sit through another hour of strategy discussion he's too tired to properly absorb anyway. Rias glanced over, taking in his heavy eyelids and slumped posture, and nodded, her expression softening. Agreed. We'll pick this up tomorrow, once everyone's had time to properly rest and process today. Issei, go home. Sleep. That's an order, not a suggestion. Yes, Bucho, he murmured, already half asleep where he sat, and didn't fully register the walk home, or Akeno's steadying hand on his arm the entire way, until he found himself finally collapsing into his own bed sometime later, sleep claiming him almost instantly, deep and dreamless for the first time in what felt like weeks. He woke well past noon the next day, sunlight slanting through his curtains in a way that told him he'd slept clean through both his alarm and, apparently, the entire morning. For a long moment he simply lay there, cataloging the absence of the cold, hollow feeling that had haunted him for the past 2 weeks, and found, with quiet relief, that whatever presence still slept beneath his thoughts had settled back into something closer to genuine dormancy rather than the restless, testing wakefulness of recent days. Partner. Drake's voice, when it came, carried none of the previous day's grim urgency, settling instead into something closer to his usual steady presence. You needed that rest. Yesterday cost you more than you realize. Yeah, Issei murmured, sitting up and rubbing a hand through his hair. Feels like it, honestly. Is it still there? The other one? Sleeping, Drake confirmed. Quieter than before, I think. Whatever happened yesterday, whatever you chose in that moment, it seemed to matter to it, in whatever way something like that experiences meaning. I do not know how long the quiet will last. But it is quiet for now. That was something, at least. Issei dressed and made his way downstairs, finding a note from his parents indicating they'd already left for work, and a text on his phone from Rias letting him know that classes had been excused for the day given the previous afternoon's events, with instructions to rest properly and report to the clubroom only once he genuinely felt ready. He spent the better part of the morning simply existing in the quiet of his own house, an unfamiliar luxury after weeks of relentless training and mounting tension, and it was early afternoon before he finally made his way toward the old school building, feeling more like himself than he had in what felt like a very long time. He found Rias alone in the clubroom when he arrived, seated at her desk with a stack of papers before her that looked, from the crest stamped across the top sheet, like official correspondence from the underworld. She looked up as he entered, her expression brightening slightly with clear relief at the sight of him looking rested and steady. You look better, she said, setting the papers aside. Feel better, he confirmed, settling onto the couch across from her desk. Drake says the presence has gone quiet again. Quieter than before, actually. That's good news, though Grayfield would want confirmation through the proper diagnostic methods before we treat it as anything more than temporary. Rias rose from her desk and crossed to join him on the couch, close enough that her shoulder brushed his as she settled beside him, an easy familiarity that had grown between them over the months in a way either of them ever felt particularly compelled to comment on directly. I wanted to talk with you, actually, before the others arrive. About what happened yesterday, and about what you said in that moment. Issei felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck, uncertain exactly which part of his desperate internal argument against the ashworm's temptation she might be referring to. What part? That you wanted your strength earned, with people who chose to stand beside you while you built it, Rias said quietly. That struck me. It struck me quite deeply, actually. I meant it, he said, meeting her eyes. Every word. I know you did. That's precisely why it struck me. She reached over and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his with a quiet, deliberate intimacy. Issei, I've watched a great many devils chase power throughout my life. My own family has no shortage of examples, ambitious relatives convinced that strength alone justifies whatever path leads to acquiring it fastest. I have spent years being wary of that impulse in others, and honestly, wary of it in myself as well, given the expectations placed on me as a Gremory heiress. You're nothing like that, Issei said immediately, surprised she'd even entertained the comparison. I know that now. I think I've known it for a while, honestly, watching you grow. But yesterday crystallized something for me that I hadn't quite let myself fully articulate before. Her grip on his hand tightened slightly, and when she continued, her voice carried a rare vulnerability that she reserved for very few moments, and very few people. You had an offer, in that instant, to end an entire ongoing crisis instantly, to become effortlessly, overwhelmingly powerful, and you refused it, specifically because that power wouldn't have been built alongside the people who matter to you. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of devil you're becoming, Issei. The kind of person you already are. He didn't trust himself to speak for a moment, the sincerity in her words settling somewhere warm and unguarded in his chest. Bucho. Rias, she corrected gently, not for the first time, though the correction always seemed to carry a little more weight each time she offered it. When it's just the two of us like this, I'd like you to call me Rias. Rias, he repeated, testing the familiarity of it, and found he liked the way it felt, an intimacy earned through months of shared trials rather than simply granted. Thank you for trusting me with that. And for everything, honestly. I don't think I'd have made it through yesterday without all of you. You made the choice yourself, she said. We simply gave you a reason to remember why the choice mattered. She leaned in then, slowly enough that he had every opportunity to pull away if he'd wanted to, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his lips, warm and genuine in a way that felt like the natural culmination of months of careful, mutual trust building steadily between them. When she pulled back, her cheeks held a faint flush that softened her usual composed authority into something more openly tender. I've wanted to do that for a while now, she admitted. I thought yesterday, of all days, was reason enough not to wait any longer. I'm glad you didn't, he said, unable to keep the warmth from his own voice, and the smile that broke across her face in response was unguarded and genuinely happy in a way he rarely got to see from her. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, her head resting against his shoulder, until the sound of footsteps on the stairs signaled the rest of the peerage's arrival, and Rias straightened, her composed authority settling back into place, though the warmth in her eyes when she glanced at him remained entirely unchanged. The afternoon's discussion, once everyone had gathered, turned toward the more practical matter of what Diodora's admission might mean going forward. Grafia joined Via's summoning circle partway through, her expression grave as she relayed the results of Surzex's initial inquiry into the matter. Lord Surzex has confirmed, through discreet channels, that certain factions within the old devil aristocracy have taken a renewed interest in ancient sealed powers over the past several months, Grafia reported. Whether Diodora Astaroth acted entirely on his own initiative or received subtle encouragement from these factions remains unconfirmed, but the timing is troubling regardless. It suggests that knowledge of the Ashworm's presence within Issei Sama's boosted gear may have already spread further than any of us would prefer. What do these factions actually want? Rias asked, her expression sharp with focused concern. That varies, depending on the faction, Grafia said. Some, we believe, are simply curious scholars and collectors of forbidden knowledge, interested in observing rather than actively interfering. Others may see genuine strategic value in either controlling or eliminating a potential threat of the Ashworm's described scale before it can mature into something beyond anyone's ability to manage. And a smaller number, I am sorry to say, may view the prospect of an awakened Ashworm as a weapon worth cultivating for their own purposes, regardless of the catastrophic risk such an awakening would represent to the wider world. So some of them want to kill me before it wakes up, Issei said flatly, and some of them want to encourage it to wake up so they can use it. Wonderful. An uncomfortable summary, but not an inaccurate one, Grafia said, with the faintest trace of sympathy beneath her professional composure. Lord Surzex has already begun quietly increasing your household's protective wards and has assigned additional discreet surveillance around Ko Academy to monitor for any unusual activity. But I would recommend increased caution regardless, particularly around unfamiliar devils or supernatural contacts who show unusual interest in Issei Sama's abilities or history. We can handle caution, Rias said firmly. What I want to know is whether there's any progress being made on a longer-term solution. Managing the seal through discipline and training has worked so far, but yesterday demonstrated clearly that external provocation can still push things to a dangerous edge, regardless of how well prepared we are internally. Grafia was quiet for a moment, considering her response carefully. There are older rituals referenced in some of the more obscure archive fragments, methods that speak of strengthening a seal permanently rather than simply reinforcing it through ongoing discipline. They are dangerous, poorly documented, and would likely require components and locations not easily accessible to a peerage still establishing its standing within the underworld's political hierarchy. But they exist, at least in theory, and I intend to continue researching them as a priority, given yesterday's events. Whatever it takes, Issei said. I'm not interested in managing this indefinitely if there's an actual way to fix it properly. I understand the sentiment, Issei-sama, and I share it, Grafia said. But I would caution against pursuing a dangerous solution recklessly, particularly given how much progress your current approach has already achieved. We will pursue a permanent solution, but carefully, and only once we're confident the risks involved are outweighed by the benefit. The meeting continued for a while longer, practical matters of increased security and continued training discussed in careful detail, until Graphia's image finally faded from the summoning circle, leaving the peerage to settle into a quieter, more contemplative mood as the afternoon stretched toward evening. It was Akeno who eventually broke the thoughtful silence, moving to sit beside Issei on the couch, her expression carrying a familiar warmth that had grown more open and less guarded over the weeks of shared crisis. "I owe you a proper conversation," she said, "about yesterday. About what I felt, watching that happen to you." "You don't owe me anything," Issei said gently. "You were amazing yesterday. All of you were." "Let me finish," she said, with a small, fond smile at his automatic deflection. "I've spent most of my life terrified of what my own inherited power might eventually make me become, watching my mother's blood as something dangerous rather than something to be proud of. Yesterday, watching you fight against something ancient and overwhelming trying to consume you, and watching you win, not through force but through choosing who you wanted to remain, it gave me something I don't think I've had before, in relation to my own fears. Hope, I suppose. Proof that inherited danger doesn't have to define the person carrying it." "Akeno, I'm not finished," she said, though her tone was gentle rather than sharp. "I care about you, Issei. I have for a while now, in ways that go well beyond simple teasing and playful affection, though I know I've hidden behind that teasing more often than I probably should have. Yesterday made something clear to me that I think I'd been avoiding fully acknowledging." She reached up and cupped his face gently, her violet eyes searching his with unusual vulnerability. "I don't want to hide behind teasing anymore. Not with you." He covered her hand with his own, holding it against his cheek. "I care about you too," he said quietly. "I have for a while. I think I was just too caught up in everything else to really let myself say it properly." Her smile, when it came, was soft and genuine in a way that transformed her entire expression. "Then perhaps we should both stop waiting," she said, and closed the remaining distance between them, her kiss warm and unhurried, carrying none of her usual playful teasing, only sincere, unguarded affection. Across the room, Koneko watched the exchange with her characteristic quiet attentiveness, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth before she returned her attention to the book she'd been reading, apparently unsurprised by the development, though the faint warmth in her expression suggested genuine happiness on their behalf. The evening settled into something quieter and gentler after that, the peerage gradually dispersing to attend to homework and errands delayed by the previous day's crisis, until eventually only Issei remained, lingering in the clubroom as twilight deepened outside the windows, processing the whirlwind of the past 2 days. The terror of the raiding game's climax giving way to the unexpected warmth of confessions he hadn't fully anticipated but found himself deeply grateful for regardless. Somewhere beneath his own thoughts, the ancient presence remained quiet, sleeping, patient in whatever way something like that experienced patience, and Issei allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, the luxury of simply feeling grateful for the people who had chosen, again and again, to stand beside him through every crisis life continued to throw in their path. Rather than dwelling exclusively on the threats still gathering somewhere beyond his immediate sight, he knew, with the clear-headed certainty that came from having survived the worst of yesterday's crisis intact, that this peace was likely temporary, that Diodora's admission had opened a door onto a wider, more complicated conflict that would demand answers eventually. But for tonight, at least, he allowed himself to simply exist in the quiet warmth of a hard-won, well-earned moment of calm, surrounded by people who had made unmistakably clear, through both words and actions, that whatever came next, he would not be facing it alone. The quiet held for nearly a week, long enough that Issei began to allow himself the cautious hope that the worst of the immediate crisis had genuinely passed. Training continued, though with a lighter, more sustainable rhythm now that the meditative techniques had become second nature rather than an unfamiliar burden, and the increased security measures Surzex had quietly arranged around Co-Academy settled into an unobtrusive background presence that most students never noticed at all. It was on a Wednesday evening, walking home from a study session at Asia's insistence after a particularly grueling exam, that Issei first noticed the stranger. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat entirely too formal for the mild autumn weather, standing beneath a street lamp on the corner near the old shrine at the edge of the residential district, watching the passing foot traffic with the kind of stillness that immediately set Issei's instincts on edge. There was nothing overtly threatening in his posture, no obvious display of supernatural power, but something about the careful, patient way his gaze tracked Issei's approach felt wrong in a manner that Issei had learned, through hard experience, not to dismiss. Koneko, walking beside him, went tense almost simultaneously, her nose wrinkling faintly. "Devil," she murmured, low enough that only he could hear. "Not one of ours. Old bloodline, though. Powerful. Friendly or not? Don't know yet." The stranger's gaze settled fully on Issei as they drew closer, and a thin, unhurried smile spread across his angular features, the kind of expression that seemed calibrated to appear pleasant, while conveying absolutely nothing about the intentions behind it. "Issei Hyoudou," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, carrying the faint formal cadence of someone who had spent considerably more time in the underworld's aristocratic circles than among humans. "I had hoped our paths might cross. My name is Cyrus Belmont, of a minor branch family serving House Agars. I wonder if I might have a brief word." "Depends what the word's about," Issei said, stopping a careful distance away, Koneko shifting subtly to stand slightly ahead of him, her posture deceptively relaxed but ready to move instantly if needed. "Word travels quickly in certain circles, Hyoudou-san, particularly regarding a sacred gear wielder whose recent rating game performance revealed something rather more interesting than the usual boosted gear capabilities." Cyrus's smile didn't waver, though something calculating flickered behind his eyes. "House Agars has, for several generations, maintained a scholarly interest in artifacts and powers predating the current era of Devil civilization. We believe we may possess resources that could genuinely assist you in managing what you're currently carrying." "And what makes you think I need your help?" Issei said, keeping his tone carefully neutral despite the wariness coiling tighter in his chest. "Because unmanaged, ancient power of the sword I suspect you're harboring tends toward one of only two outcomes, Hyoudou-san. Either it consumes its host entirely, or it destroys everything around them in the attempt to break free. Neither outcome serves your interests, and I suspect you've already glimpsed enough of the danger firsthand to understand precisely what I mean." Cyrus tilted his head slightly, studying Issei's reaction with obvious interest. "House Agars is prepared to offer genuine assistance." "Resources?" "Knowledge accumulated over centuries regarding exactly this kind of ancient sealed power. All we would ask in return is the opportunity to study the phenomenon, under carefully controlled and entirely safe conditions, of course." "Study it," Issei repeated flatly. "You mean study me?" "A distinction without much practical difference, I'm afraid, given the nature of what we're discussing," Cyrus said, with an apologetic tilt of his head that felt entirely performative. "But I assure you, House Agars has no interest in exploitation. Our motivations are purely scholarly." "Purely scholarly?" Koneko repeated, her voice flat with open skepticism. "That's not what it smells like." Cyrus's smile finally faltered, just slightly, at the blunt challenge. "I understand a certain degree of caution is warranted, given recent events involving Lord Diodora's rather clumsy attempt at provocation. I assure you, House Agars operates through considerably more sophisticated and, frankly, more ethical means." "I'll pass," Issei said firmly, taking Koneko's silent cue and beginning to move past the stranger, unwilling to continue a conversation that felt increasingly like the opening move of something he had no interest in playing along with. "That is, of course, your prerogative," Cyrus said unbothered, his voice carrying after them without any apparent urgency. "Though I would encourage you to consider your options carefully, Hyoudou-san. Not every interested party sharing our scholarly curiosity will approach you with such transparency and courtesy. Some, I suspect, are considerably less patient, and considerably less concerned with your well-being throughout whatever process they might attempt." Issei stopped, glancing back despite himself. "Is that a threat?" "A warning," Cyrus corrected, his smile returning, thin and unreadable. "Offered freely, and without expectation of anything in return. House Agars's door remains open, should you reconsider. I trust you know how to find us, should the need arise." He inclined his head in a small, formal bow and turned, disappearing into the gathering evening shadows with an ease that suggested considerable practiced skill at making unobtrusive exits, and Issei stood on the quiet street for a long moment afterward, processing the uneasy weight of the encounter. That was creepy, he said finally. Very, Koneko agreed. We should tell Bucho immediately. They reached the club room within the hour, and Rias's expression darkened considerably as Issei relayed the encounter in careful detail, Koneko occasionally interjecting additional observations about Cyrus's scent and bearing that suggested a devil of considerable age and standing despite his relatively young appearance. House Agar's, Rias said, once the account had finished, her tone thoughtful and troubled in equal measure. One of the 72 pillars, old and influential, though they've kept a relatively low profile in recent generations compared to some of the more politically active houses. If they've taken a direct interest in the Ashworm, that's considerably more concerning than Diodora's individual scheming. He said they wanted to study it, Issei said. Study me, basically. Offered resources and knowledge in exchange. A classic approach for gathering leverage over someone useful, Zenobia observed grimly from her position near the window. Offer help freely at first, establish a relationship of dependence, and only later reveal the true cost of that assistance, once the recipient has become too entangled to easily refuse. That was my read as well, Rias said. I want everyone exercising increased caution going forward. No unfamiliar devils, regardless of how courteous or seemingly helpful their approach, should be trusted without thorough vetting through Grafia or my own family connections first. He also mentioned other interested parties, Issei said, ones less patient and less concerned about my well-being. Made it sound like a threat, even if he tried to frame it as friendly advice. Rias's expression tightened further. That tracks with what Grafia already told us, unfortunately. If multiple factions are genuinely aware of and interested in the Ashworm, House Agar's approaching you directly, however unsettling, may actually represent one of the more measured responses we could expect. I'll contact Grafia immediately and have her look into House Agar's recent activities and any documented interest in ancient sealed artifacts. The following days brought a renewed vigilance to the peerage's daily routines, Koneko and Kiba taking turns discreetly shadowing Issei during any solo travel between home and school, while Akeno began incorporating additional wards into his morning meditative sessions. Protective measures meant to help mask the Ashworm's presence from external supernatural detection as an added layer of security against further unwanted attention. Grafia's follow-up report, delivered several days later, confirmed House Agar's long-documented interest in pre-civilization artifacts and sealed powers, though her investigation found no direct evidence connecting them to Diodora's earlier scheme, suggesting the two threats, while related in their underlying interest, likely operated independently rather than as part of a coordinated conspiracy. Small comfort, Rias observed, once Grafia's report had concluded. Though it does suggest we're dealing with scattered, competing interests rather than a single unified threat, which may actually work in our favor, if we can avoid any of them gaining a decisive advantage over the others. Or it means twice as many people trying to get their hands on me for twice as many different reasons, Issei said, unable to keep a note of weary frustration from his voice. Feels less like an advantage and more like being surrounded from multiple directions at once. Akeno, seated beside him, reached over and took his hand, a quiet, grounding gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over the past week. We'll handle each threat as it comes, she said firmly. The same way we've handled everything else. Together. Together, Koneko echoed from her usual spot, not looking up from the book she was reading, though the word carried a quiet, unwavering certainty that settled something anxious in Issei's chest despite the mounting complexity of the danger surrounding him. It was nearly 2 weeks after the encounter with Cyrus Belmont, on an otherwise unremarkable Sunday afternoon, that the true scope of what they were facing finally became unmistakably clear. Issei had gone alone to the convenience store near his house, a mundane errand that felt almost defiantly normal after weeks of escalating supernatural tension, when he felt the unmistakable prickle of powerful magic gathering nearby, sharp and sudden enough that he dropped the basket he'd been carrying and spun toward the source on pure instinct. A circle of dark, unfamiliar sigils bloomed across the pavement of the empty parking lot behind the store, and from its center emerged a figure unlike anything Issei had encountered before, tall and gaunt, wrapped in tattered robes the color of dried blood, its face obscured beneath a hood from which 2 points of sickly yellow light gleamed where eyes should have been. "Hi to Issei," it said, its voice a dry rasp that seemed to carry from somewhere much further away than the distance between them suggested. "The Ashworm's vessel. I have traveled a very long way to finally make your acquaintance." Drake's voice erupted within Issei's mind, sharp with an alarm the dragon had rarely shown even during the worst of the previous week's crises. "Partner. That is not a devil. That is not anything native to this world at all. Be extremely careful." Issei raised his gauntlet on instinct, the familiar crimson light flaring to life around his arm, and took a careful step back, his mind racing through the growing list of enemies who might have finally decided direct confrontation was worth the risk. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want?" The hooded figure tilted its head, the gesture carrying an unsettling, insectal quality that made Issei's skin crawl. "What I want," it rasped, "is precisely what you have been so carefully, so admirably, refusing to give away. And I intend to take it from you regardless of your continued refusal." The sigils beneath its feet flared brighter, and the air around the parking lot began to shimmer and warp, the ordinary Sunday afternoon suddenly feeling very far away indeed. Issei backed further away, scanning the empty parking lot for any avenue of retreat that wouldn't simply lead the fight toward more populated streets, his mind racing even as his body settled automatically into the defensive stance Kiba had spent weeks drilling into him. "Drake, what is this thing? You sound genuinely worried, and that's not exactly reassuring." "I do not know its precise nature," Drake admitted, his voice tight with focused concentration. "But I sense old magic around it, magic that does not follow the patterns of devils, angels, or fallen. Whatever sent it here, it did not come from any of the factions we have been bracing ourselves against." The hooded figure advanced a slow, deliberate step, the tattered edges of its robes seeming to writhe faintly even in the absence of any wind. "You need not fear unnecessary suffering, vessel. My purpose is not to harm you needlessly. Only to claim what sleeps within you, and return it to those who have waited considerably longer than you can likely comprehend for its release." "Yeah, that's not happening," Issei said, forcing steadiness into his voice despite the cold dread pooling in his stomach. "Whatever you're working for, whoever sent you, you can tell them I already turned down a much more polite offer a couple weeks ago. My answer hasn't changed." "Polite offers were never going to succeed," the figure said, something that might have been amusement threading through its dry rasp. "Your will is considerable, vessel. Admirable, even by the standards of your fragile kind. But will is not the only avenue toward release. Sometimes the door simply needs to be broken open from outside, rather than persuaded to open from within." It raised one skeletal hand, and the sigils beneath its feet pulsed in response, dark tendrils of energy lashing outward across the pavement toward Issei with a speed he barely managed to avoid, throwing himself sideways as one tendril tore a gouge through the asphalt where he'd been standing a heartbeat earlier. Boost! The familiar surge of doubled strength rolled through him, and Issei used the momentum of his dodge to close distance rather than retreat further, gambling that proximity might disrupt whatever ritual space the figure was attempting to establish. His fist connected solidly with what should have been the figure's chest, and the impact sent a jarring shock up his arm entirely disproportionate to the resistance he'd expected, as though he'd struck something far denser and more solid than the tattered robes suggested. The figure staggered back half a step, seemingly more surprised than injured, its sickly yellow eyes narrowing beneath its hood. "Interesting. Your physical capability exceeds what I anticipated from the reports I received." "Glad I could surprise you," Issei said, already backing away again, wary of overcommitting against an enemy whose true capabilities remained entirely unknown. He risked a glance around, calculating whether he could draw this fight away from the store entirely, toward the empty lot behind the old shrine where at least innocent bystanders would be less likely to stumble into danger. The figure did not give him the chance. Dark tendrils lashed out again, faster this time, and Issei felt one catch his ankle even as he dodged, the sensation like being gripped by something simultaneously freezing cold and burning, a wrongness that sent pain lancing up his leg entirely unlike any injury he'd sustained before. He crashed to the pavement, the tendrils' grip tightening, and felt, with rising alarm, a pulling sensation that seemed to originate not from his physical body but from somewhere deeper, an insistent tug against the very seal Graphia's techniques had spent weeks helping him reinforce. Partner! Drake's voice was sharp with urgency. It is trying to force the seal directly, bypassing your own mind and will entirely. This is different from what happened during the raiding game. This is a direct assault, not a temptation. Then help me fight it, Issei gritted out through clenched teeth, forcing himself back to his feet despite the tendril's grip, drawing on every ounce of the physical discipline Kiba had drilled into him over weeks of focused training. Boost! He tore free of the tendril's grip through sheer boosted strength, ignoring the fresh lance of pain that came with the movement, and threw himself back from the hooded figure, putting several meters of distance between them while he tried to steady his breathing and assess the damage. The pulling sensation faded slowly, reluctantly, leaving behind an unpleasant residual ache that reminded him uncomfortably of the cold that had accompanied the ashworm's earlier attempts to surface. You cannot outrun what I represent, vessel, the figure said, unhurried, apparently unbothered by his escape. I have patience considerably beyond what your short life has taught you to expect from an opponent. And I have considerably more where that came from. More tendrils erupted from the sigil circle, a dozen at once this time, and Issei realized with a spike of genuine alarm that he was rapidly running out of options for a fight he had wandered into completely unprepared and entirely alone. Drake, I need backup. I can't call Rias fast enough for this. You do not need to call her, Drake said, something like relief entering his voice for the first time since the confrontation began. Look up. A blast of destruction magic tore through three of the advancing tendrils simultaneously, crimson and black energy dissolving them into harmless motes of dissipating shadow, and Issei turned to see Rias descending rapidly from above, her expression thunderous, Akeno and Koneko close behind her, having apparently sensed the disturbance from wherever they'd been and moved with a speed that suggested genuine, immediate alarm. Get away from him, Rias said, landing between Issei and the hooded figure with a protective fierceness that left absolutely no room for negotiation, another orb of destruction magic already gathering at her palm. The figure regarded her with what might have been mild curiosity rather than any genuine concern. The Gremory heiress. I had wondered how long it would take you to notice your pawn's absence. You have exactly one chance to leave before I stop being interested in questions, Rias said, her voice carrying the full weight of her family's authority and power. A generous offer, though ultimately unnecessary, the figure said, and to Issei's considerable surprise, it actually began to retreat, the dark sigils beneath its feet dimming as it withdrew a measured step. I have learned what I came to learn today. The seal holds stronger than my sources suggested, and the vessel's protectors respond considerably faster than anticipated. I will require a different approach. You're not leaving, Rias said, her destruction magic flaring brighter, clearly intent on ending the threat rather than allowing a strategic retreat. The figure's hooded head tilted again, that same unsettling, insectal motion. I am afraid that decision was never truly yours to make. The sigils flared one final time, and the figure dissolved into the circle's dark light, vanishing entirely along with the entire ritual formation, leaving behind only scorched pavement and the lingering, unpleasant residue of whatever ancient magic it had employed. The parking lot fell silent except for their collective heavy breathing, and Rias turned immediately to Issei, her earlier fury giving way instantly to focused, thorough concern as she crossed the remaining distance and began checking him over, her hands running lightly along his arms, his shoulders, searching for injury. I'm okay, he said, though his voice shook slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. It grabbed my ankle, tried to pull at the seal directly, but I got free before it managed anything permanent. I think. You think, Rias repeated, her voice tight with barely restrained worry. Drake says the seal held, Issei clarified. It felt different from before. More violent. Less like temptation and more like an actual assault. Koneko knelt beside him, sniffing carefully at the ankle the tendril had gripped, her expression troubled. Wrong smell, she reported. Not the same as before. Older. Colder. That thing wasn't a devil, fallen angel, or anything else I've encountered before, Akeno said, her lightning still crackling faintly at her fingertips as she scanned the surrounding area for any sign of the enemy's return. Whatever it was, it came from somewhere else entirely. Rias's expression, when she finally straightened, carried a grim determination that Issei had rarely seen from her, even during their most dangerous previous encounters. This changes things considerably, she said. We're no longer dealing solely with ambitious devils looking to exploit or eliminate a potential threat within established political structures. Something entirely outside our usual understanding has taken a direct, physical interest, and it was willing to attack you alone, in broad daylight, in the human world, without any apparent concern for the consequences of that exposure. Which means whatever it's working for considers the risk worth taking, Kiba said grimly, arriving at a run alongside Zenobia, both of them having clearly rushed to catch up once they'd sensed the disturbance as well, though too late to join the actual confrontation. We need to contact Grafia immediately, Rias said, already turning to lead them back toward the old school building, one hand remaining protectively at the small of Issei's back as they walked. And I think, given today's events, we need to seriously consider whether Issei should be permitted to move about unaccompanied at all, until we have a clearer understanding of exactly what we're facing. Bucho, I can't live my whole life surrounded by an armed escort, Issei protested, though the words carried less conviction than he might have wanted, the lingering ache in his ankle and the memory of that cold, pulling sensation against his very core still fresh enough to undercut his usual stubborn independence. No, Rias agreed. But until we understand what just attacked you, and why, and how it managed to locate you so precisely despite the wards Akeno has been maintaining, some additional caution is not merely advisable. It's necessary. The walk back to the club room passed in tense, watchful silence, the peerage maintaining a tight protective formation around Issei the entire way, and by the time they reached the familiar warmth of the club room, the adrenaline of the encounter had fully drained away, leaving Issei feeling hollowed out and shaken in a way that the previous crises, for all their danger, hadn't quite managed to produce. Grafia's response, once contacted, carried an urgency that matched the gravity of the situation, her usual composed demeanor visibly strained as Rias relayed the details of the encounter in careful, thorough detail. A being wrapped in tattered crimson robes, wielding tendrils of cold, corrupting energy, speaking of those who have waited considerably longer than a human lifespan for the ashworm's release, Grafia repeated, her expression darkening with each detail. I need to consult certain older archives immediately, ones I had hoped we would not need to reference. Rias-sama, I want you to understand that what you've described does not match anything within our current understanding of devil, angel, fallen angel, or even yokai capability. If my suspicions prove correct, we may be dealing with something considerably older and more dangerous than any of the political threats we've been preparing for. Older how? Issei asked, a fresh chill settling over him at the grim weight in Grafia's voice. Grafia met his eyes through the summoning circle, her expression carrying a gravity that made the previous week's concerns feel, suddenly, almost quaint by comparison. Older, Issei-sama, than the current pantheons themselves. Older, perhaps, than the sealing of the ashworm itself. If something from that original era has endured, patient and hidden, all this time specifically to reclaim what was taken from it, then we are no longer simply managing a dangerous inheritance. We may be standing at the very edge of a conflict that predates every faction currently active in this world, one that none of us are yet fully prepared to face. The words settled over the clubroom like a physical weight, and outside the windows, evening deepened rapidly into night, the wind picking up once more with a sound that, for the second time in as many weeks, seemed almost like the distant, patient beat of enormous, ancient wings. Grafia's warning lingered in the clubroom long after her image had faded from the summoning circle, the peerage settling into an unusually subdued quiet as the weight of what she'd described sank in fully. Issei sat on the couch, Akeno's hand still wrapped around his, staring at the spot where the circle had been as though it might yield further answers if he simply looked hard enough. Older than the current pantheons, he said finally, testing the words aloud as though saying them might make them feel less impossible. How does something get older than the actual gods? There are theories, Rias said, settling into the armchair across from him, her expression thoughtful despite the tension still visible in the set of her shoulders. Old devil scholarship occasionally references the idea that the current age, the one governed by the familiar pantheons we all know, wasn't the first. That something came before, and that whatever ended it left remnants behind, scattered and mostly forgotten, sleeping in places nobody thought to look anymore. And you think that thing today was one of those remnants, Kiba said? I think it's the most coherent explanation available to us right now, Rias admitted. Which isn't the same as certainty. But given what it said, about having waited considerably longer than a human lifespan, about representing something with a claim to the ashworm predating even its original sealing, I don't see a more plausible alternative. Koneko, curled in her usual spot with a fresh bag of Pocky she hadn't touched once, spoke up quietly. If it's that old, how do we fight it? Bucho's magic hurt it. That's something, at least. It is, Rias agreed. Though I suspect what we saw today was closer to a probing attempt than a full commitment. It withdrew the moment the odds shifted against it, which suggests either caution, or that it genuinely didn't consider today's confrontation important enough to risk itself fully over. A scout, Zenobia said, arms crossed where she stood near the window, her sword resting against her shoulder in the manner that had become almost habitual over the past weeks. The same way Cyrus Belmont's approach may have been House Agar's testing the waters before committing more fully. Whatever we're dealing with now, it sounds like it's still gathering information rather than launching a genuine assault. Which means we still have time to prepare, Rias said. Not unlimited time, clearly, but time nonetheless. I intend to use it well. The conversation continued for a while longer, contingencies and precautions discussed with the same methodical thoroughness that had characterized every crisis meeting since the ashworm had first stirred, but Issei found his attention drifting after a while, exhaustion and lingering shock from the day's confrontation finally catching up to him in full. Akeno noticed, as she always seemed to, and gently steered the conversation toward its natural conclusion, insisting that further planning could wait until morning. The others dispersed gradually, Kiba and Zenobia offering quiet reassurances on their way out, Asia pressing a small paper charm into Issei's palm that she promised would help ward against ill intent while he slept, though her earnest, worried expression suggested the gesture was as much for her own peace of mind as his. Eventually only Rias, Akeno, and Koneko remained, the four of them settling into a comfortable quiet as the club room's lamplight pooled warm against the deepening night outside. I don't want to go home alone tonight, Issei admitted, the words slipping out before he'd fully decided to say them, an honesty born more from exhaustion than any deliberate choice. That thing found me completely alone, in the middle of an ordinary Sunday afternoon. It's stupid. I know it's probably not going to just show up at my house. It's not stupid, Rias interrupted gently. It's a reasonable response to what you experienced today. And you're not staying alone tonight regardless. I've already decided that much. I could stand watch, Koneko offered immediately, sitting up straighter, her golden eyes serious. We'll take turns, Akeno said. Though I suspect none of us will get much sleep regardless, given the circumstances. They ended up back at Issei's house together, his parents conveniently away for a work trip that had been scheduled weeks in advance, the timing either fortunate or, Issei found himself uneasily wondering, perhaps not entirely coincidental given how neatly it aligned with the day's crisis. Akeno set to work almost immediately upon arrival, weaving protective wards into the corners of his room with careful, practiced motions, her lips moving in a quiet incantation that left a faint golden shimmer lingering in the air long after she'd finished. That should hold against most forms of scrying or direct magical intrusion, she said, straightening from her work with a satisfied nod. Nothing is completely foolproof, but it should at least buy us warning, if something tries to locate you here tonight. Thank you, Issei said, watching her with quiet appreciation, still faintly amazed, even after weeks of growing closeness, at the depth of care she brought to protecting him. You didn't have to do all that. Of course I did, she said, settling onto the edge of his bed with a small, fond smile. There was never a question of whether I would. Rias claimed the chair near his desk, apparently intent on remaining alert through at least part of the night despite everyone's assurances that they'd take turns, while Koneko curled herself into a compact shape on the small couch near the window, her senses, Issei knew, remaining sharp and attentive even as her eyes drifted closed. Issei lay in bed, the weight of the day pressing down on him even through the reassuring presence of his peerage scattered around the room, and found sleep reluctant to come despite his exhaustion, his mind circling back again and again to the hooded figure's cold, patient voice, to the pulling sensation against the seal that had felt so fundamentally different from anything he'd experienced before. "You're still awake," Rias observed quietly, not looking up from the book she'd retrieved from his shelf, though her tone made clear she'd been tracking his restlessness regardless. "Can't turn my brain off," he admitted. "Keep thinking about what it said? About things that have waited longer than a human lifespan." "What does that even mean exactly? Decades? Centuries? Longer?" "I don't know," Rias said honestly. "And I think, until Graphia's research yields something more concrete, speculating too much will only feed anxiety rather than useful preparation." "Probably right." He was quiet for a moment, staring at the ceiling, before a different thought surfaced, one he hadn't quite let himself voice yet. "Rias, if it comes down to it, if there's ever a real choice between letting that thing take the ashworm from me, or letting it hurt one of you trying to stop it, I need you to promise me something." She set the book down, her full attention settling on him with the particular seriousness she reserved for moments that genuinely mattered. "What?" "Don't let me make that choice alone," he said. "Whatever it looks like, whenever it happens. I don't want to be standing there deciding by myself again, the way I almost had to during the raiding game. I trust all of you more than I trust my own judgment when things get that bad." Rias was quiet for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her crimson eyes. "I promise," she said finally. "Though I want you to understand something in return. We are not going to let that choice happen at all, if we can possibly help it. Not because we doubt your judgment, but because losing you, in any form, whatever the immediate justification, is not a price any of us are prepared to pay. Not for the ashworm, not for anything, Rias." "I mean it, Issei," she said, her voice carrying a quiet fierceness. "You matter to this family. Not as a pawn, not as a vessel for something ancient and dangerous, but as yourself. We will find another way. I refuse to accept that the only paths forward involve sacrificing you, one way or another." From the couch by the window, Koneko's quiet voice drifted through the darkness, proving she hadn't been as fully asleep as she'd appeared. "She's right. Don't even think about that as an option. We'll figure something out. We always do." Akeno, still seated on the edge of the bed, reached over and brushed her fingers gently through Issei's hair, a soothing, wordless gesture that carried more comfort than any further words might have managed. "Sleep," she said softly. "Let tomorrow worry about tomorrow's problems. Tonight you're safe, and you're surrounded by people who aren't going anywhere." Issei let out a slow breath, some of the tension finally beginning to ease from his shoulders under the combined weight of their reassurances, the quiet certainty in the room settling over him like a physical blanket. "Okay," he murmured. "Okay. Thank you. All of you." "Sleep," Rias echoed gently, returning to her book, though her gaze lingered on him a moment longer before she let him drift. He did sleep, eventually, deeper than he'd expected given the day's events, and if he dreamed, the dreams left no lasting impression beyond a vague, distant sense of vast wings and a wound-colored sky, quieter and more patient than before, watching, waiting, but for once, not reaching. Morning came gray and overcast, rain tapping softly against the windows as Issei woke to find the room exactly as he'd left it the night before, Rias dozing lightly in the chair with the book fallen open across her lap, Akeno curled beside him on the bed at some point during the night, Koneko still alert on the couch despite the early hour, her golden eyes tracking his movement the instant he stirred. "No trouble," she reported quietly, before he could even ask. "Quiet all night." "Good," he said, relief loosening something in his chest he hadn't fully realized had remained tight even through sleep. "That's good." Rias stirred at the sound of their voices, blinking awake with the particular disorientation of someone who hadn't intended to actually fall asleep in a chair. "Everything all right?" "Quiet night," Issei confirmed, and something in her expression eased at the words, a tension he hadn't fully registered releasing from her shoulders. They gathered for a quiet breakfast before school, the ordinary domesticity of the morning feeling almost surreal against the backdrop of the previous day's crisis, and it was during that quiet meal, Akeno moving efficiently between the stove and the table with an ease that suggested she'd cooked in his kitchen more than once before. That Issei found himself struck by a simple, grounding realization. Whatever ancient conflict was gathering on the horizon, whatever forces continued circling with their own competing claims on the power sleeping inside him, he was not facing any of it from the isolated, uncertain place he might have occupied months earlier, before this family of his own choosing had gathered around him so thoroughly and so completely. The threat was real, and growing, and genuinely frightening in ways he was only beginning to fully understand. But so, too, was everything standing between that threat and the people he loved, a wall built not from raw power alone, but from choice, and trust, and the accumulated weight of countless smaller moments just like this one, quiet and unremarkable and entirely irreplaceable. Drake, sensing the direction of his thoughts as the dragon so often did, offered a rare, warm rumble of agreement from within the gauntlet. A good thing to remember, partner, when the days ahead grow more difficult, as I suspect they will. Power alone has never won a war worth winning. But power held together by people willing to stand and hold the line alongside you, that has toppled far older and far darker things than whatever waits for us next. Issei glanced around the table, at Rias sipping her tea with quiet, watchful care, at Akeno humming softly as she plated the last of breakfast, at Koneko finally reaching for her long-neglected pocky with something like her usual contentment returning to her expression, and allowed himself, despite everything still gathering unseen beyond the rain-streaked windows, a small, genuine smile. Whatever came next, he would face it exactly the way he'd faced everything else since the day he first activated the boosted gear. Together, Graphia's research took the better part of a week, and when she finally returned with results, her summons came not as a routine evening check-in but as an urgent request for the entire peerage to gather immediately, regardless of the hour. Issei arrived at the club room to find Rias already pacing behind her desk, a tension in her shoulders that told him the weight had worn on her considerably more than she'd let on during the intervening days. The summoning circle bloomed to life, and Graphia's image resolved with a gravity that immediately silenced whatever quiet conversation had been filling the room. I have confirmed the nature of what attacked Issei-sama, she said, without preamble. The archives call it, among other names lost to time, the Choir of the First Silence. A faction, if the word even applies accurately, of beings who existed before the current pantheons rose to prominence, remnants of whatever order governed the world during the age the ashworm itself is said to have ended. Remnants, Rias repeated. You mean survivors? Survivors, or perhaps more accurately, fragments, Graphia said. The texts are frustratingly vague on the precise nature of what they are now, whether they retain anything resembling the full consciousness or power they once possessed, or whether what confronted Issei-sama was closer to an echo, a fraction of something once much greater, still bound by purpose long after the body and mind that first held that purpose faded away. Purpose being get the ashworm back, Issei said flatly. Precisely, Graphia confirmed. The text suggests the choir considers the sealing of the ashworm an act of theft, or perhaps betrayal, committed against them by the gods who rose afterward to claim the world the ashworm's rampage had emptied. Whether that framing is accurate, or merely the self-serving narrative of something ancient and vengeful, I cannot say with confidence. But their motivation appears consistent across every fragment I located. They want what was taken from them returned, by whatever means necessary. And if they get it, Kiba asked, what happens then? Graphia's expression, already grave, darkened further. The texts are not encouraging. If the choir successfully extracts the ashworm from its current vessel, the most consistent theory suggests they intend to use it precisely as it was once used before, to unmake the current age entirely, clearing the world for whatever new order they believe themselves entitled to build in its place. The words landed heavily across the room, and for a long moment nobody spoke, the weight of what Graphia had just described settling over each of them individually. So it's not just a threat to me anymore, Issei said finally, his voice quiet. It's a threat to everyone. Everything. If the choir succeeds, yes, Graphia said. Which is why Lord Surzex has authorized considerably more direct involvement going forward. This is no longer solely a matter for Rias-sama's peerage to manage alone, though he recognizes the trust and bond already established between you and your household, and does not wish to strip that away without cause. Rather, he intends to provide additional resources, protection, and, should it become necessary, direct intervention from the underworld's highest authorities. What kind of resources? Rias asked, her strategic mind already turning over the implications. To start, a location, Grafia said. The archives reference a site, hidden and warded for millennia, believed to be the original location of the Ashworm's ceiling. If any permanent solution exists for strengthening or perhaps even fully closing the fragment currently residing within Issei-sama, the ritual knowledge required is most likely to be found there, assuming the site has survived intact after so many centuries. You want us to go there, Issei said. I want you to consider it, Grafia corrected carefully. The journey itself would not be without risk, given the choir's demonstrated willingness to act directly, and the site's exact condition after so long remains unknown. But if a genuine permanent solution exists anywhere, that location represents our best chance of finding it, rather than continuing to manage an ongoing, escalating threat indefinitely through training and vigilance alone. Issei looked around the room, at Rias's focused, calculating expression, at Akeno's quiet, thoughtful consideration, at Koneko watching him with steady, unwavering attention, at Kiba and Zenobia exchanging a glance that suggested they'd already begun weighing tactical considerations of their own. I want to go, he said. If there's an actual chance to fix this permanently instead of just holding the line forever, I want to take it. Then we prepare properly, Rias said, her tone settling into the focused, decisive cadence she reserved for genuine crisis planning. Grafia, I'll need everything you have on the site's location, any known wards or dangers, and whatever timeline you'd recommend for the journey given the choir's apparent activity. I will compile everything within the next several days, Grafia said. In the meantime, I would strongly recommend continued vigilance and, if possible, accelerated training. Whatever defenses the ancient site may still possess, and whatever the choir attempts between now and your arrival, you will want every possible advantage available to you. The meeting continued for a while longer, practical details discussed with mounting focus, until Grafia's image finally faded and the peerage began the familiar process of dispersing for the evening, each member carrying the weight of the revelation in their own particular way. Issei lingered in the clubroom after most of the others had gone, staring out the window at the darkened school grounds, processing the scale of what he'd just agreed to pursue. You're thinking too loudly again, Koneko said, appearing at his side with her characteristic quiet suddenness, though this time she didn't retreat to a respectful distance, instead settling close enough that her shoulder brushed against his arm. Can't really help it, he admitted. Feels like the stakes just jumped considerably higher than I was prepared for. Unmaking the entire current age. That's not exactly a normal Tuesday problem. No, she agreed. But you're not facing a normal Tuesday problem alone, either. She was quiet for a moment, her golden eyes fixed on the darkened grounds outside rather than on him directly, and when she spoke again, her voice carried an unusual, careful weight. Issei, I've been thinking about something. Since the rating game, since I held your hand and told you we were real, that you didn't need to let it out to keep us safe. Yeah? I meant it as more than just talking you down from a crisis, she said, still not quite looking at him, a faint flush coloring her cheeks that was rare enough to make him pay very close attention. I've cared about you for a while now. Longer than I've probably let show. Watching you fight that thing off, watching you choose us over easy power, it made something clearer to me that I think I'd been avoiding admitting, the same way Akeno was avoiding her own feelings before the rating game. Issei felt his breath catch slightly, surprised by the direction of the conversation despite everything else occupying his thoughts that evening. Koneko, You don't have to say anything right now, she said quickly, finally meeting his eyes, her usual composed stoicism giving way to something more vulnerable and open than he'd seen from her before. I just wanted you to know. Especially with everything getting more dangerous. I didn't want to keep quiet about it, and regret not saying anything, if something happened. He reached over and took her hand, the same small, cold hand that had anchored him during the rating game's most terrifying moment, and found himself smiling, warm and genuine despite the heaviness of the evening's earlier revelations. I care about you too, he said. I have for a long time. I think I was just being an idiot about noticing it properly, same as I apparently was with Akeno. A small, surprised smile broke across her face, genuine and unguarded in a way that transformed her usual stoic expression entirely. You are kind of an idiot about that stuff, she agreed, though there was no real bite in the words. Fair, he said, laughing softly despite everything, and found, in the quiet warmth of that moment, a small but genuine reprieve from the mounting weight of everything Grafia had just described. She leaned against his shoulder, comfortable and easy in a way that suggested she'd been wanting this closeness for longer than she'd let herself show, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the darkened school grounds outside offering no answers to the enormity of what still lay ahead, but the quiet presence beside him offering something arguably more valuable in the moment, a reminder of exactly what, and who, he was fighting to protect. We should tell Bucho and Akeno, Koneko said eventually, straightening slightly, though she made no move to release his hand. About us. If that's all right. Definitely all right, he said. I don't want to hide it from them. They deserve to know. They found Rias and Akeno still in the club room, deep in quiet conversation about logistics for the journey Grafia had proposed, and the news, when Issei and Koneko shared it together, was met not with surprise but with warm, immediate acceptance, Akeno pulling Koneko into a brief, affectionate hug while Rias offered a knowing, pleased smile that suggested she'd suspected the development for some time already. I'm happy for you both, Rias said, and the sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Truly. Whatever complications the coming days bring, I'm glad you have this, at least, to hold on to. The evening settled into something quieter after that, practical planning giving way gradually to simple, comfortable companionship, the four of them lingering together in the club room's warm lamplight far longer than any remaining logistics genuinely required. Issei found himself, despite the mounting danger gathering on the horizon, feeling steadier than he had in days, anchored by the accumulated weight of choices made and affections openly acknowledged, ready, as much as anyone reasonably could be, for whatever the ancient site and the choir of the first silence still had waiting for them. The days that followed fell into a new and demanding rhythm, training intensified beyond anything Issei had experienced even during the frantic preparation before the raiding game against Diodora. Rias divided their remaining time before the planned journey into deliberate phases, mornings devoted to Akeno's meditative discipline, now expanded to include techniques meant to help Issei sense the choir's particular signature before it could close distance unnoticed, afternoons given over to increasingly demanding sparring sessions with Kiba and Zenobia both, and evenings spent in strategic planning that grew more detailed with each passing day as Grafia continued sending updated fragments of information regarding the ancient site's suspected defenses and history. The site itself predates written record among the Devil clans, Grafia explained, during one such evening briefing, a rough sketch of the location's suspected layout hovering within the summoning circle's projected light. What fragments survive suggest it lies within a pocket dimension, sealed away deliberately at the same time the ashworm itself was bound, likely to prevent exactly the kind of intrusion the choir now represents. Accessing it will require a specific ritual key, one I am still working to acquire through contacts within my own family's older archives. How much longer until we can actually leave? Issei asked, unable to keep a note of restless urgency from his voice, the accumulated tension of the past several days wearing at his usual patience. A matter of days, I hope, rather than weeks, Grafia said. I understand the urgency, Issei-sama, and I assure you I am pursuing this with all appropriate speed. But a ritual of this significance cannot be rushed carelessly without considerable risk, particularly given what we now understand about what waits for us should the choir succeed in their aims. Rias, seated at her desk with the same focused intensity she'd carried through every strategic discussion since the revelation of the choir's true nature, nodded slowly. We'll use the time to continue strengthening our preparation. Better to arrive fully ready a few days later than to rush in unprepared and lose the advantage entirely. The waiting proved harder than the training itself, the accumulated tension of anticipating an attack that might come at any moment, from any direction, wearing steadily at everyone's nerves despite their best efforts to maintain focus. It was on the fourth evening of that waiting, as Issei walked home from an exhausting sparring session with Kiba, Koneko at his side as had become their new customary arrangement, that the choir made its next move. The attack came without warning, dark sigils blooming across the pavement of the quiet residential street with none of the previous encounter's deliberate, unhurried patience. This time, 3 hooded figures emerged simultaneously rather than one, their tattered crimson robes writhing faintly in the still evening air, sickly yellow eyes fixing on Issei with immediate, focused intent. Multiple, Koneko said sharply, already shifting into a defensive stance beside him. They're not scouting this time. No, one of the figures rasped, its voice carrying the same dry, distant quality as the one from before, though whether it was the same individual entity or simply another fragment of the same collective purpose, Issei couldn't tell. This time, we finish what patience has already delayed too long. Issei activated the gauntlet on instinct, crimson light flaring around his arm as he backed toward Koneko, calculating distances and escape routes even as the 3 figures began to advance with a coordinated, deliberate slowness that felt considerably more threatening than the previous encounter's more exploratory approach. Drake's voice was tight with focused urgency. 3 of them, partner. Whatever we faced before was testing our defenses. This feels considerably more committed. Call Rias, Issei said to Koneko, even as he raised his guard against the first tendrils of dark energy lashing out from the nearest figure. I'll hold them as long as I can. Kaneko's hand found his shoulder briefly, a wordless promise, before she darted back several steps to establish the necessary distance for a clear magical signal, her voice already rising in the sharp, urgent tones of an emergency summons even as Issei threw himself into evasive motion, dodging the first figure's attack while trying to keep the other 2 from flanking him entirely. Boost! The doubled strength helped him weather the first direct clash, his fist connecting with the nearest figure's chest with enough force to send it staggering back several paces. But the reprieve proved brief as the second and third figures closed distance from opposite directions, their combined tendrils weaving an increasingly complex web of dark energy that Issei found himself struggling to track and evade simultaneously. One tendril caught his leg, the familiar cold burning sensation lancing up through his calf, and he felt, with rising alarm, the same insistent pulling against his seal that had marked the previous encounter, though considerably stronger now, 3 sources of that terrible cold working in concert rather than a single entity's isolated effort. Partner! Drake's voice carried genuine alarm now. They are working together, combining their assault against the seal directly. This is far more dangerous than before. I noticed, Issei gritted out, tearing free of the tendril's grip through sheer boosted strength, though the movement cost him considerably more than the previous encounter had, a fresh wave of disorientation washing over him as the pulling sensation lingered even after the physical contact broke. The 3 figures regrouped, unhurried despite his continued resistance, their sickly yellow eyes tracking his movements with patient, calculating focus. The vessels will remain strong, one observed, its rasping voice carrying something that might have been grudging respect. But will alone cannot hold indefinitely against 3 fragments working as one. Yield now, and this need not become considerably more unpleasant. Not happening, Issei said, forcing himself back into a defensive stance despite the mounting ache spreading through his leg and the lingering disorientation still clouding his focus. You'll have to actually beat me for it. As you wish, the figure said, and all 3 lunged simultaneously, dark tendrils converging on his position from 3 directions at once, a coordinated assault that left him no clear avenue of retreat or defense. He barely managed to throw himself sideways, boosted reflexes the only thing saving him from being caught fully in the crossfire. But even his evasion cost him, one tendril catching his shoulder, as he dodged, the cold burning sensation spreading rapidly enough that he felt his knees threatening to buckle beneath the combined weight of physical strain and the seal's mounting pressure. It was in that moment, as he struggled to regain his footing against 3 coordinated, ancient enemies with no immediate backup in sight, that a blast of golden light tore through the evening air, catching the nearest figure directly and sending it sprawling with a dry, rasping cry of genuine pain. Get away from him! Asia's voice, unexpectedly fierce, carried across the street as she arrived at a dead run, her sacred gear already active, healing light gathering protectively around her palms even as she positioned herself between Issei and the remaining 2 figures with a courage that belied her usually gentle, retiring nature. Asia, get back! This is too dangerous! Issei started, Even as he forced himself upright, grateful despite his alarm for the momentary reprieve her intervention had provided. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly, not looking away from the advancing figures, her healing light already beginning to work at the edges of the wound on his shoulder even from a distance, the sensation a welcome, soothing contrast to the lingering cold burn. "Zenovia's right behind me." We felt Koneko's signal. True to her word, Zenobia arrived moments later, her sword already drawn and crackling with the particular blessed energy that had proven effective against fallen angels and other unholy threats in the past, and the two remaining figures paused their advance, apparently recalculating the odds now that the confrontation had shifted from a single isolated target to a defended position. "Reinforcements," one of the figures observed, its tone carrying something that might have been mild irritation rather than genuine concern. Predictable, given the vessel's demonstrated attachments. "No matter. We have learned what we required regardless." The two remaining figures began to withdraw, their dark sigils dimming as they retreated toward whatever unseen threshold had brought them to the street in the first place, and Zenobia surged forward, clearly intent on preventing their escape, but the figures dissolved into shadow and dark light before she could close the distance, vanishing entirely and leaving behind only the lingering, unpleasant residue of their passage and the scorched pavement marking where the confrontation had unfolded. Issei sank to his knees the moment the immediate threat passed, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard enough that Asia had to physically catch his shoulders to keep him from toppling entirely, her healing light working steadily now to address both the physical wounds and the lingering, cold ache that continued radiating from where the tendrils had made contact. "That's better," Drake said, his voice carrying clear relief as the seal's disturbed pressure gradually settled back toward its usual quiet dormancy under the combined effect of Asia's healing and Issei's own returning focus. "That was close, partner. Closer than I would have liked." "Yeah," Issei murmured aloud this time, too exhausted to bother keeping the conversation private. "Definitely noticed that myself." Koneko arrived moments later, having apparently completed her summons and returned at a dead sprint the instant she registered the fight's escalation, dropping to her knees beside him with an urgency that spoke volumes about how genuinely frightened she'd been during her brief absence. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I should have stayed closer, should have called for help sooner." "You did exactly the right thing," Issei said, managing a tired but genuine smile despite his exhaustion. "Got help here in time. That's what mattered." Rias arrived shortly after, along with Akeno and Kiba, the four of them having clearly moved with considerable urgency once Koneko's signal reached them, and the scene that followed carried the same familiar, thorough concern that had marked every crisis since the ashworm first began stirring, Rias's hands checking him over with focused precision, while Akeno's protective wards flared to life around the immediate area, guarding against any possibility of the choir's return. "Three of them this time," Rias said, once the initial flurry of concern had settled and Issei had recounted the encounter in careful detail. "Working in concert against the seal directly. That's a considerable escalation from the previous single scout. They said they'd learned what they required," Issei said. "Not exactly reassuring, whatever that means. It means we're running out of time to reach the ancient site and pursue Graphia's proposed solution," Rias said grimly. "I'll contact her immediately. If the choir is preparing for a more decisive assault, we need to move considerably faster than originally planned, regardless of the risks involved in rushing the ritual preparations." Graphia's response, once contacted, carried the same grave urgency, her voice tight with barely restrained concern as she confirmed that the ritual key required for accessing the ancient site had, fortunately, been secured just that afternoon, the timing either a fortunate coincidence or, as several members of the peerage privately suspected, not entirely coincidental given the choir's escalating pattern of behavior. "We can begin the journey tomorrow, if you're prepared," Graphia said. "Though I would strongly recommend Issei-sama rest fully tonight, given the strain of today's encounter. Whatever waits within the ancient site, you will want to arrive at your full strength, not exhausted from a battle fought mere hours before departure." "Tomorrow," Issei repeated, a mixture of relief and renewed apprehension settling over him in equal measure. "Okay. Tomorrow, then." The peerage gathered that night much as they had the week before, Issei's house once again serving as an impromptu gathering point, protective wards renewed and strengthened around every window and doorway, the accumulated weight of the coming journey settling over the group with a gravity that made sleep, once again, considerably harder to find than exhaustion alone might have suggested. But this time, at least, Issei found himself facing that uncertainty surrounded not merely by allies, but by a family bound together through choice and affection freely given, and as he finally drifted towards sleep sometime past midnight, Akeno's steady presence beside him and Koneko's watchful alertness from her usual post near the window, he allowed himself the cautious, hard-won hope that whatever the ancient sight held in store, they would face it, as they had faced everything else. Together. The ritual to open passage into the pocket dimension took place the following evening in a clearing deep within a forest reserve on the outskirts of the underworld's central territories, a location Grafia had selected specifically for its isolation and the layered wards already established around the surrounding area by generations of careful devil stewardship. Surzex himself arrived to oversee the departure, his presence carrying a quiet, formidable authority that settled the peerage's nerves considerably despite the gravity of what lay ahead. "I wish I could accompany you directly," Surzex said, addressing Rias with the particular warmth he reserved for his sister even amid the seriousness of the occasion. "But my presence within the sealed site itself might disturb wards calibrated for considerably smaller-scale intrusion. I will remain here, monitoring the connection as closely as possible, and I will not hesitate to intervene the moment circumstances allow, should you need it." "I understand," Rias said. "Thank you, Oniai-sama. For everything." Surzex's gaze shifted to Issei, and something in his expression softened further, a genuine warmth that Issei had come to associate with the Devil King's rare, unguarded moments. "Issei Hyoudou. Whatever waits within that sight, know that you carry with you not merely my sister's trust, but considerable hope from those of us who understand exactly what's truly at stake here. Return safely. All of you." "We will," Issei said, with more confidence than he entirely felt, though the sentiment carried genuine conviction regardless. Grafia stepped forward then, the ritual key, a small, ancient-looking pendant carved with sigils that seemed to shift and writhe faintly even in the dim evening light, resting in her open palm. "The passage will remain open for exactly 72 hours, she explained, addressing the assembled peerage with careful precision. "Beyond that window, the ritual's power will fade, and the connection will close regardless of whether you have completed your objective. I would strongly recommend against remaining within the site any longer than absolutely necessary." "Understood," Rias confirmed, accepting the pendant with careful reverence. The ritual itself unfolded with a slow, deliberate grandeur, ancient sigils blooming across the clearing's forest floor in patterns considerably more intricate than anything Issei had witnessed before, layers of light and shadow weaving together until a shimmering threshold finally resolved in the air before them, a doorway into somewhere that existed, quite literally, outside the ordinary boundaries of their world. "Ready?" Rias asked, glancing around at her assembled peerage, Akeno and Koneko flanking Issei, Kiba and Zenobia positioned protectively at the formation's edges, Asia's healing gear already primed in quiet readiness. A chorus of quiet affirmations answered her, and together they stepped through. The sensation of passage defied easy description, a moment of weightless disorientation that left Issei's stomach lurching uncomfortably, and then, all at once, they found themselves standing within a space unlike anything he'd encountered before. The ancient site stretched out around them beneath a sky that held no sun, no stars, only a soft, diffuse silver light that seemed to emanate from the very air itself, illuminating a landscape of broken stone pillars and half-collapsed structures, ruins of something that might once have been a temple, or a fortress, or perhaps something for which no modern word adequately applied. "This is it," Rias breathed, turning slowly to take in the full scope of the ruins spread before them. "The ceiling sight. It's beautiful," Asia said quietly, and despite the eerie, otherworldly quality of the place, Issei found himself agreeing, the ruins carrying a haunting, melancholy grandeur that spoke of something vast and significant having occurred there, long before any of them had been born. Koneko's nose wrinkled almost immediately, her golden eyes narrowing as she scanned the surrounding structures. "Old magic here," she reported. "Very old. And something else underneath it. Cold. Like before. The choir's influence?" Zenobia asked, her hand already drifting toward her sword's hilt. Maybe, Koneko said. Or just the memory of them. Hard to tell yet. Drake's voice stirred within Issei's mind, carrying an unusual, weighted solemnity. Partner. I feel it now, clearer than I ever have before. Whatever lives within your gear, it remembers this place. I can feel that recognition, even through the distance of centuries and hosts between us. It remembers being sealed here, Issei murmured, more to himself than anyone else, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the site's ambient temperature. They moved carefully through the ruins, Kiba scouting ahead with practiced caution, Koneko's senses guiding them past what she identified as several lingering traps, ancient ward remnants still active enough after so many centuries to pose genuine danger to anyone who stumbled into them carelessly. The deeper they moved into the ruins, the more the silver light seemed to shift and deepen, taking on a faint, golden warmth the closer they drew toward what appeared to be the structure's central chamber, a vast circular space dominated by a massive stone dais at its center, ancient sigils carved into its surface glowing with a soft, persistent light despite the countless centuries that had clearly passed since anyone had last tended to this place. This is where it happened, Rias said quietly, approaching the dais with careful reverence. Where they sealed the ashworm. Issei felt a pull the moment he crossed into the chamber's threshold, subtle at first but growing steadily stronger as he approached the dais, an insistent, almost magnetic draw that seemed to originate from somewhere deep within his own chest rather than from the ancient stone itself. Partner, Drake said, his voice carrying careful warning. Be cautious. Whatever remains of this place's original purpose, it clearly still recognizes what you carry. I feel it, Issei confirmed, forcing himself to slow his approach despite the pull's insistence, Akeno's hand finding his arm in a steadying, grounding gesture that helped anchor him against the growing sensation. As they drew closer to the dais, the sigils carved into its surface flared brighter still, and a figure began to resolve within the chamber's center, translucent and shimmering, clearly some form of ancient projection or preserved consciousness rather than a physical presence, its form vaguely humanoid but carrying an unmistakable, otherworldly quality that spoke to origins far removed from anything currently walking the modern world. Visitor, the figure said, its voice carrying a strange, layered quality, as though multiple voices spoke in careful unison. It has been a very long time since any living being crossed this threshold. You carry the mark of what we sealed here. The vessel has returned, though not, I think, by the same hand that first bore this burden. I'm not the original vessel, Issei confirmed, stepping forward despite the lingering pull, some instinct telling him this presence, whatever it was, did not represent an immediate threat. The ashworm's fragment found its way into my sacred gear somehow, generations later. I need help understanding how to properly control it. Maybe even seal it more permanently, if that's possible. The figure regarded him with what might have been careful consideration, its shimmering form flickering faintly as though the effort of maintaining coherent presence after so many centuries carried real cost. The seal you carry was never meant to be permanent in the way you likely hope, young vessel. It was crafted as a containment measure, buying time rather than offering true resolution, because true resolution required something the original binders lacked the power to achieve in the crisis of that ancient age. What kind of resolution? Rias asked, stepping forward to stand beside Issei, her expression sharp with focused attention. The ashworm's power did not spring from malice, the figure said. It sprang from imbalance, from an ancient wound in the world's fundamental order that the being who became the ashworm sought, in its own broken, ultimately destructive way, to heal by unmaking everything touched by that wound entirely. The binders of that age understood this, even as they fought to contain the resulting devastation. They believed, though they lacked the means to attempt it themselves, that true resolution would require not merely sealing the ashworm away, but healing the wound that gave rise to it in the first place, allowing what remained of its consciousness to finally rest, rather than continuing to strain eternally against containment. How do we heal something like that? Issei asked, the weight of the revelation settling heavily over him. I don't even know what wound you're talking about. The figure's shimmering form flickered again, and when it spoke, its layered voice carried something that might have been genuine sympathy. The wound exists within the fragment itself, young vessel, carried alongside its power within your sacred gear. To heal it requires understanding, not force. Compassion, not conquest. The fragment has waited a very long time for someone willing to approach it as something more than a threat to be managed or a weapon to be wielded. I sense, in your bearing, in the company you keep, that you may be capable of offering precisely that. But I cannot promise the path will be simple, nor without genuine risk. The choir, Zenobia said, stepping forward with characteristic bluntness. They're hunting him. Hunting the fragment. If we take too long figuring out how to heal this wound, they might reach him first. The figure's expression, insofar as its shimmering, translucent features conveyed anything resembling human expression, darkened considerably at the mention of the choir. The first silence remains active then. I had hoped, after so many centuries of quiet, that their purpose had finally faded along with their strength. This complicates matters considerably. They will not want the wound healed. They want the ashworm's power reclaimed and wielded, precisely as it once was, to finish what was interrupted so many ages ago. So we're racing against time either way, Rias said grimly. Whether it's the choir's escalating assaults, or the 72-hour window on our passage back. I can offer guidance, the figure said. Fragments of ritual and understanding preserved here since the original sealing. But the true work, the actual healing this fragment requires, must come from the vessel himself, and from those he trusts enough to stand beside him through it. That is not something I, or this place, can provide on your behalf. Issei looked around at his peerage, at Rias's steady, focused determination, at Akeno's quiet, grounding presence, at Koneko's unwavering attention, at Kiba and Zenovia's readiness, at Asia's earnest, hopeful concern, and felt something settle into place within his chest, a resolve that had been building steadily since the first flicker of black light in the training hall weeks earlier. Then let's start, he said. Whatever it takes. Show us where to begin. The ancient figure's shimmering form inclined its head, something like approval passing across its otherworldly features, and the chamber's silver-golden light deepened further still, the ancient sigils across the dais beginning to shift and rearrange themselves into new, unfamiliar patterns, the first steps of a ritual that had waited, patiently, for countless centuries, for someone finally willing to attempt it. The ritual the ancient figure guided them through was unlike anything Issei had experienced before, less a conventional spell and more a kind of deliberate, guided meditation, the assembled sigils across the dais forming a careful lattice of light around him as he settled at its center, his peerage arranged in a protective circle just beyond the pattern's edge. You will need to enter the fragment's memory directly, the figure explained, its shimmering form hovering close enough to oversee the ritual's careful preparation. Not merely sense its presence, as you have during your previous encounters, but actually descend into the wound itself, into whatever remains of the consciousness and history that gave rise to the ashworm's original devastation. It will not be pleasant. It may, in fact, be genuinely painful, both for you and for whatever fragment of that ancient consciousness still lingers within your sacred gear. What do I need to do? Issei asked, forcing steadiness into his voice despite the mounting apprehension building in his chest. Open yourself to it fully, without the defensive discipline you have spent weeks carefully building, the figure said. I understand the difficulty of what I ask. Every instinct your training has instilled will resist this. But healing requires vulnerability, not fortification. You cannot approach an ancient wound with your guard raised and expect anything but further conflict. Rias, standing just beyond the sigil's edge, her expression carrying visible reluctance despite her evident trust in the process, spoke up sharply. That sounds considerably more dangerous than anything we discussed before departing. If he lowers his guard entirely, what's to stop the fragment from simply overwhelming him the moment the opportunity presents itself? A fair concern, the figure acknowledged. The fragment's power remains genuinely dangerous, and vulnerability does carry real risk. But I do not believe brute containment will ever fully resolve what troubles the vessel long term. The choice, ultimately, belongs to him. Issei considered the warning carefully, weighing the very real danger against the alternative of continuing to manage an escalating threat indefinitely, the choir's assaults growing steadily more coordinated and dangerous with each passing encounter. I trust the process, he said finally. And I trust all of you to pull me back, if something goes wrong. We will, Akeno said immediately, her voice carrying fierce, unwavering conviction. Whatever happens in there, we're not letting you go. Koneko knelt at the sigil's edge, taking his hand one final time before the ritual began in earnest, her golden eyes steady and certain. Come back to us, she said simply. That's all we ask? I will, he promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The ancient figure raised a translucent hand, and the sigils around him flared to full brilliance, the silver-golden light of the chamber intensifying until it swallowed his vision entirely, the sensation of falling washing over him even as his physical body remained perfectly still at the center of the pattern. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing not within the ancient ruins, but within a landscape that existed, quite clearly, somewhere else entirely, a vast plain beneath that same wound-colored sky he'd glimpsed twice before during moments of crisis, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction without any visible boundary or feature to mark distance or scale. Boy! The voice, when it came, carried none of the previous cold, calculating menace he'd grown accustomed to associating with it. Instead, it sounded tired. Ancient beyond easy comprehension, and profoundly, achingly tired. I'm here, Issei called out, turning slowly to take in the vast, empty landscape. I came to understand. Not to fight you. Not to take anything from you, or give anything to those who want to use you as a weapon. I want to understand what actually happened to you. A vast shape began to resolve on the horizon, the same enormous dark form he'd glimpsed before, wings unfurling slowly against the wound-colored sky, and as it drew closer, Issei found himself able, for the first time, to see it clearly rather than through the fractured, panicked glimpses of previous encounters. It was, unmistakably, a dragon, ancient and vast beyond any scale he'd previously encountered, its scales the color of old ash, its eyes, when they finally settled on him, holding an unmistakable, profound sorrow rather than the malice he'd half expected. You wish to understand, the ashworm said, settling its enormous form onto the plain before him with a weariness that seemed to weigh down every movement. Very well. Then witness. The landscape around them shifted, and Issei found himself, suddenly, viewing scenes that unfolded like memories not quite his own, impressions and fragments layered with an emotional weight that struck him with visceral, overwhelming force. He saw an ancient world, vibrant and thriving under a sky that held actual sunlight rather than the wound-colored void of the ashworm's current existence, and at its center, a great wrong being committed, a betrayal so profound and foundational that it had torn something fundamental within the world's very fabric. I was not always what you see before you now, the ashworm said, its voice carrying that same aching sorrow as the visions continued to unfold. I was created, in that ancient age, to be a guardian, a keeper of balance between what was and what might become. But those I served betrayed the very purpose they set for me, twisting the world's order for their own ambition, and in the wound left by that betrayal, something within me broke as well. Issei watched, transfixed and increasingly heartbroken, as the visions continued, the ancient dragon's slow, agonizing transformation from guardian to catastrophe, not born of malice but of grief so profound and so thoroughly betrayed that it curdled, over uncounted years, into something that sought, in its shattered logic, to unmake the entire broken order rather than continue witnessing its slow, corrupt decay. I did not wish to destroy, the ashworm said, as the visions finally began to fade, returning them to the empty, wound-colored plain. I wished only to heal what had been broken. But I no longer understood how to heal without also unmaking, and so I became the very catastrophe those who once trusted me were forced to seal away, for the safety of everything that remained. I'm sorry, Issei said, and found the words carried genuine, profound sincerity rather than mere social nicety. That's an awful thing to have happened to you. To have your purpose betrayed like that, and then to lose yourself trying to fix something that was never your fault to begin with. The ashworm's vast head lowered slightly, an unmistakable gesture of genuine surprise. Few have ever offered such sentiment, in all the centuries of my confinement. Most who have sensed my presence have sought either to destroy the danger I represent, or to seize the power born from my grief for their own ambitious purposes. You are the first, in longer than I can properly measure, to simply grieve alongside me. Because it deserves grief, Issei said. What happened to you was genuinely unfair. But I also can't let you finish what that grief started. Too many people I love would be hurt, would be unmade, if that happened. I need you to understand that, even as I understand what you went through. I know, the ashworm said, something like resignation entering its ancient voice. I have always known, even in my worst, most consuming moments. That knowledge is precisely why the sealing succeeded, all those centuries ago. Some fragment of what I once was, some sliver of the guardian I began as, has always resisted the full unmaking, even as the rest of me strained against it. Can that fragment be strengthened? Issei asked. Can we heal the wound, instead of just containing the damage it caused? The ashworm regarded him for a long, waited moment, its ancient, sorrowful eyes studying him with an intensity that felt like being weighed against some vast, incomprehensible standard. Perhaps, it said finally, if you are willing to carry a portion of that grief alongside me, rather than merely containing it as a threat to be managed. Healing requires shared weight, young vessel. Are you prepared to carry that, for as long as you and I remain bound together? Issei thought of Rias, of Akeno, of Koneko, of every member of his peerage who had chosen, again and again, to stand beside him through every crisis this journey had demanded. He thought of the accumulated weight of choices made freely, of trust built through countless small moments of care and vulnerability, and found, in that reflection, the answer settling into place with quiet, unshakable certainty. Yes, he said. I'm prepared to carry it. Not alone, though. I have people who'll help me carry it, the same way they've helped me carry everything else. The ashworm's vast form shifted, something in its ancient bearing easing slightly, the wound-colored sky above them flickering, for just a moment, towards something closer to the ordinary blue of ordinary daylight. Then let us begin, it said. The wound will not heal quickly, nor easily. But perhaps, with genuine partnership rather than mere containment, it can finally begin to close. The landscape around them began to shift and dissolve, and Issei felt a warmth spreading through his chest entirely different from the cold, burning sensation that had accompanied every previous encounter with the ashworm's presence, something gentler, more like the slow mending of an old, long-neglected injury finally receiving proper care. It was in that moment, as the healing process began to take hold, that a violent tremor tore through the vision entirely, the wound-colored sky splitting with a sound like tearing fabric, and the ashworm's vast head snapped up with sudden, sharp alarm. They have found this place, it said, its voice carrying fresh urgency. The choir. They sense what we are attempting, and they will not allow it to succeed, not when it threatens to deny them the weapon they have waited so long to claim. Issei felt the vision beginning to fracture around him, the pull of his own physical body calling him back toward the ancient chamber, and beyond that pull, faintly but unmistakably, he could hear Rias's voice, sharp with alarm, and the clash of combat already beginning somewhere in the world he'd left behind. Issei's return to his physical body came with a jarring lurch, his eyes snapping open to find the ancient chamber transformed from the quiet, reverent sanctuary it had been moments before into a scene of active, chaotic combat. Dark sigils bloomed across the chamber's edges, considerably more numerous than either previous encounter, at least 6 hooded figures emerging simultaneously from the shadows between the ruin's broken pillars, their sickly yellow eyes fixed with unified, hungry intent on the dais at the chamber's center where his still form remained anchored within the healing ritual's lattice of light. They will not interrupt this, the ancient figure's voice cut through the chaos, its shimmering form flaring with sudden, fierce brightness as it moved to interpose itself between the advancing choir and the ritual's delicate pattern. This place remembers its purpose, even after so many centuries. I will not allow that purpose to be corrupted now. Rias had already moved, destruction magic gathering at both palms as she positioned herself protectively before Issei's vulnerable, ritual-bound form, her voice cutting across the chamber with commanding authority. Formation 2. Protect the dais, whatever it costs. The peerage responded with the practiced coordination of countless hours of training, Kiba's blade flashing silver as he intercepted the nearest figure's advance, Zenovia's blessed sword crackling with holy energy as she drove back a second, Akeno's lightning arcing through the chamber's silver-golden light and bright, controlled bursts that sent 2 more figures staggering back with dry, rasping cries of genuine pain. Issei felt the pull of the ritual still anchoring him, half his awareness remaining tethered to the ashworm's vast, sorrowful presence even as the other half struggled to re-engage with the physical crisis unfolding around him. "I need to finish this," he called out, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining the delicate balance between both states of awareness simultaneously. "If I break the connection now, we might lose whatever progress we've already made." "Then finish it," Rias said, not looking away from the combat, another blast of destruction magic tearing through the chamber to intercept a fourth figure's advance. "We'll hold them. Trust us." Koneko had positioned herself directly at the dais' edge, her enhanced strength driving back the fifth figure's attempt to breach the protective formation, her golden eyes never once leaving Issei's vulnerable form even as she fought. "Go," she called to him, her voice carrying fierce, unwavering conviction despite the visible strain of the ongoing combat. "We've got this. Finish healing it." Asia, positioned near the formation's rear, her healing gear already active and working steadily to mend the small wounds accumulating across the peerage's front line, added her voice to the chorus of encouragement. "We're not letting anything happen to you, Issei-san. Trust us, the way you always tell us to trust you." The conviction in their collective voices settled something within Issei's fractured focus, and he allowed himself, despite every instinct screaming at him to fully re-engage with the physical danger, to sink back into the ritual's pull, trusting his peerage's protection completely as he descended once more into the wound-colored landscape where the ashworm waited. The ancient dragon's vast form had shifted since his brief absence, agitation clearly visible in the restless shifting of its enormous wings, its ancient eyes carrying fresh alarm alongside the lingering sorrow. "They have breached the outer wards," it said, its voice carrying genuine urgency now. "The healing remains incomplete. If they succeed in severing our connection before the process finishes, the wound may reopen entirely, potentially worse than before, given how close we have already come to genuine mending." "Then let's finish it," Issei said, forcing steady resolve into his voice despite the mounting danger on both sides of the ritual's delicate boundary. "Tell me what else needs to happen." "The wound requires acknowledgement, not merely of my grief, but of the fear that grief eventually curdled into," the ashworm said. "Fear that my purpose, my very existence, had become meaningless in the face of betrayal. That fear is what ultimately drove the unmaking, more than the grief itself. To heal fully, that fear must be met with something stronger. Purpose freely chosen, rather than purpose merely assigned. What purpose would that even look like, after everything that happened to you?" The ashworm considered the question for a long, weighted moment, its ancient gaze studying him with renewed intensity. "Perhaps," it said slowly, as though testing the shape of an idea long unconsidered, "purpose found in partnership, rather than in solitary guardianship. I was broken, in part, because I bore the entire weight of my purpose alone, with no one to share the burden when betrayal struck. You do not carry your burdens alone, young vessel. Perhaps that difference alone might be enough to anchor a purpose sturdy enough to finally resist the fear that once consumed me." "Then let's build that together," Issei said. "Right now. You don't have to be alone in this anymore. I'm here, and so are the people fighting to protect this ritual right now, risking everything to give us the chance to finish this properly." The wound-colored sky above them flickered again, more insistently this time, streaks of genuine blue beginning to bleed through the oppressive void, and the ashworm's vast form seemed, gradually, to lose some of its restless agitation, settling instead into something closer to genuine, cautious hope. "Then let us try," it said, lowering its massive head until its ancient eyes met Issei's directly, close enough that he could see, reflected in their depths, fragments of the world it had once protected, vibrant and thriving before betrayal shattered everything it had once believed in. "Share the weight with me, Issei Hyoudou. Not as vessel and burden, but as partners, the way you already stand with those fighting to protect us both, even now." Issei reached out, some instinct guiding the gesture despite having no clear physical form within this shared mindscape, and pressed his palm against the ancient dragon's massive snout, feeling, in that contact, a surge of shared understanding that transcended simple words, centuries of accumulated grief and fear and betrayed purpose flowing between them in a current that felt less like invasion and more like genuine, mutual recognition. "We share it," Issei said, his voice carrying the full weight of genuine conviction. Together. However long it takes to fully heal. The wound-colored sky finally broke entirely, streaks of ordinary blue spreading rapidly across what had been an endless, oppressive void, and the ashworm's ancient form seemed to straighten, some fundamental weight lifting from its posture as centuries of accumulated grief finally began, genuinely, to ease. "Thank you," it said, its voice carrying a warmth entirely absent from every previous interaction. "I had forgotten, across so many centuries of isolation, what it felt like to be genuinely understood rather than merely feared or coveted. This healing will not complete instantly, young partner. Wounds of this depth require continued tending, continued choice, made freely again and again across whatever time remains to us both. But the path forward exists now, clearer than it has been and longer than either of us can properly measure. Then we'll keep choosing it," Issei said. "Every day, if that's what it takes." The mindscape began to dissolve around them, the pull of his physical body growing insistent once more, and as Issei felt himself drawn back toward the ancient chamber, and the ongoing battle still raging there, he caught one final glimpse of the ashworm's ancient, sorrowful eyes, no longer quite so heavy with unresolved grief, watching him depart with something that might, genuinely, have been hope. Issei's return to full awareness came with none of the previous jarring lurch, instead settling over him gradually, gently, like surfacing from deep, restful sleep rather than being wrenched from one state of being into another. He opened his eyes to find the chamber still locked in active combat, but something had fundamentally shifted, a warmth radiating outward from his own chest that seemed to be affecting the very air around the dais, the silver-golden light of the chamber deepening into something richer, more vibrant, than before. The gauntlet on his arm flared to sudden, brilliant life, crimson light blazing with an intensity he'd never witnessed before, and beneath that familiar crimson, rather than the threatening violet black of previous crises, a warm, golden undertone that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. "Partner," Drake's voice carried unmistakable wonder. "Whatever you just accomplished, I have never sensed anything quite like this before. The fragment's presence, it no longer feels like a threat straining against containment. It feels almost like a second partner, rather than a burden barely held in check." "That's exactly what it is now," Issei said, rising from the dais with newfound strength surging through his limbs, the healing warmth in his chest translating into something that felt, unmistakably, like genuine power freely offered rather than dangerous energy barely restrained. "Let's finish this fight properly." He surged into the ongoing battle, and the difference in his capability was immediately, unmistakably apparent, his boosted strikes carrying a golden-edged crimson light that sent the nearest hooded figure staggering back with a dry, rasping cry of genuine alarm rather than mere pain. "Impossible," the figure rasped, its sickly yellow eyes widening beneath its tattered hood. "The wound cannot have healed. Not so quickly. Not without genuine partnership," Issei finished, closing the distance with a decisive, powerful strike that sent the figure dissolving into scattered, harmless motes of shadow. "Something your choir apparently never bothered trying." The remaining figures, watching their companion's swift defeat, exchanged uncertain glances beneath their hoods, the coordinated confidence that had marked their earlier assault visibly faltering in the face of this unexpected development. Rias seized the shift in momentum immediately, another blast of destruction magic tearing through the chamber with renewed, focused ferocity. "Now," she called out, "while they're off balance." The peerage surged forward as one, Kiba's blade finding its mark against the second figure, Zenovia's blessed sword driving back a third, Akeno's lightning arcing between two more with devastating, coordinated precision, and within moments, the battle that had seemed, mere minutes earlier, genuinely uncertain, resolved decisively in their favor, the remaining choir fragments dissolving one by one into scattered shadow, their earlier confident purpose broken against the unexpected strength of a wound they had believed impossible to heal so swiftly. The ancient figure's translucent form, which had remained steadfastly interposed before the dais throughout the entire confrontation, finally relaxed, its shimmering presence flickering with something that might have been relief. "The choir's fragments retreat, for now," it said. "Though I suspect this defeat will not deter their broader purpose entirely. What you accomplished here today, young vessel, is remarkable regardless. I had not believed genuine healing possible, not after so many centuries of failed attempts by those who came before you. I had help, Issei said, glancing around at his peerage, exhaustion beginning to settle over him now that the immediate danger had passed, though it carried none of the hollow, frightened quality of previous crises, instead settling into something closer to the satisfied weariness of hard-won, meaningful victory. I couldn't have done any of this alone. Rias crossed the chamber to stand before him, her expression carrying a mixture of profound relief and unmistakable pride, her hands settling on his shoulders as she studied him carefully, checking for injury with the same thorough attention she always brought to his well-being. "Tell me what happened," she said. "What you found in there." Issei recounted the experience as best he could, the ashworm's true history, the betrayal that had curdled its original guardianship into catastrophic grief, the healing that partnership rather than mere containment had finally allowed to begin, and as he spoke, he watched understanding and something like genuine wonder spread across the faces of his gathered peerage. "So it's not gone," Koneko said, when he'd finished. "The ashworm. It's still there, but different now." "Different," Issei confirmed. "A partner now, rather than a threat. Drake says he's never sensed anything quite like it before. I think, going forward, I might actually have 2 dragons to work with, rather than 1 dragon and 1 dangerous secret I've been desperately trying to contain." "That is remarkable," Akeno said softly, wonder evident in her violet eyes as she studied the golden-edged crimson light still lingering faintly around his gauntlet. "And considerably less terrifying than what we prepared ourselves to face today." The ancient figure's shimmering form flickered once more, its layered voice carrying genuine warmth, as it addressed the assembled peerage. "The healing remains ongoing, young vessel. What you accomplished today opened the path forward, but true resolution will require continued choice, continued partnership, across whatever time remains ahead of you. The choir will not simply abandon their purpose after a single defeat, however decisive. Remain vigilant, even as you carry this newfound strength forward." "We will," Rias said firmly. "Thank you for your guidance. Without it, none of this would have been possible. The gratitude belongs to your vessel, and to those who chose to stand beside him so completely," the figure said. "This place has waited a very long time to witness genuine healing, rather than mere containment. I am glad, after so many centuries, to have finally witnessed it." The journey back through the shimmering threshold passed in a haze of exhausted, satisfied relief, the peerage emerging back into the ordinary forest clearing to find Surzex and Grafia waiting with visible, barely contained anxiety that dissolved instantly into profound relief the moment they registered the peerage's safe, victorious return. "You succeeded," Surzex said, crossing the clearing quickly to clasp Issei's shoulder with genuine warmth. "I felt the shift in the connection, though I confess I couldn't discern exactly what had changed." "Tell me everything." The debrief that followed stretched well into the evening, Issei recounting the full scope of what had transpired within the ancient site while Grafia listened with focused, careful attention, occasionally interjecting questions that helped clarify the precise nature of the transformation that had occurred within his sacred gear. "This is unprecedented," Grafia said finally, once the account had concluded. "Every previous reference to the ashworm's fragments describes them as threats to be contained, never as potential partners capable of genuine healing. I will need to consult further with the archives, but I suspect what you've accomplished here today may prove significant well beyond your own personal circumstances, Issei-sama." "How so?" Rias asked. "If a fragment of the ashworm can be genuinely healed rather than merely contained," Grafia said, "it raises the possibility that other ancient wounds, other lingering catastrophes from that same broken age, might similarly be addressed, rather than left to fester indefinitely as threats requiring perpetual vigilance. This could represent the beginning of something considerably larger than a single vessel's personal struggle." The implications settled heavily over the gathered group, and Issei found himself, despite the day's exhausting trials, feeling a renewed sense of purpose beneath the accumulated weariness, a sense that whatever came next, whatever the choir's continued pursuit ultimately demanded of him, this victory represented something genuinely meaningful rather than merely another crisis narrowly survived. Surzex, watching the exchange with evident approval, finally spoke, his tone carrying the particular gravity he reserved for genuinely significant moments. "Rest, all of you. You've earned it thoroughly. We'll discuss the broader implications, and the choir's likely next moves, once everyone has had proper time to recover. The journey home passed in comfortable, exhausted quiet, and it was only once they'd finally settled back within the familiar warmth of the old school building's club room, the ordinary evening light of their own world filtering gently through the windows, that Issei allowed himself to fully feel the weight of everything the day had accomplished. Rias settled beside him on the couch, her hand finding his, her expression carrying a warmth that spoke to far more than mere relief at a crisis survived. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "Genuinely, deeply proud. What you did in there, choosing understanding over fear, partnership over conquest, that's not something many people, devil or otherwise, would have found the courage to attempt." "I had good teachers," Issei said, glancing around at Akeno, at Koneko, at the whole gathered peerage who had made this hard-won victory possible through their steadfast, unwavering support. "And good reasons to believe it was possible. You all showed me that, over and over, every time things got hard." Drake's voice stirred once more within his mind, carrying a warmth that felt, in that moment, entirely new. "Partner, whatever comes next, whatever the choir still intends, I believe we face it now with considerably more strength than we possessed even this morning. Two dragons, bound not merely by circumstance, but by genuine, freely chosen partnership. That is no small thing." "No," Issei agreed quietly, aloud this time, a small, satisfied smile spreading across his tired features as he settled more comfortably against Rias's side, Akeno and Koneko drawing close on his other side, the whole peerage gathering in the clubroom's warm evening light with the particular closeness of a family that had, once again, faced something genuinely terrifying and emerged, together, considerably stronger for having done so. "No, it's really not." Outside the windows, evening deepened gently into night, calm and undisturbed, and for the first time in what felt like a very long while, the distant sound of wings on the wind carried nothing but quiet, patient peace. Thanks for listening.